The story of Viking survival begins not with ships or battles, but with the land itself, a landscape that shaped every aspect of their existence. Scandinavia, the homeland of the Norse peoples, was not an easy place to call home. For centuries, its terrain and climate forced human beings into a daily confrontation with nature's extremes. Harsh winters, scarce sunlight, and unforgiving terrain defined life in this northern frontier. And from these conditions, the Vikings forged one of history's most resilient cultures. Scandinavia in the early medieval period stretched across present-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, extending into the rugged outposts of Iceland and Greenland. It was a region caught between two elemental forces, ice and fire. Glacier and snow blanketed much of the land for months at a time, while deep volcanic activity, especially in Iceland, revealed the Earth's raw power. This was a place where freezing seas clashed with volcanic eruptions, and where survival depended on understanding the balance between destruction and renewal. The winters were long, stretching from October to May in many areas. In the northernmost settlements, winter meant not only snow and ice, but also the absence of the sun itself. For weeks, sometimes months, the sun would vanish beyond the horizon, leaving communities in perpetual twilight. Darkness dominated daily life, broken only by firelight or oil lamps. In contrast, summers were brief but intense, with the midnight sun flooding the land with light that allowed for planting, hunting, and preparation for the next inevitable winter. This rhythm of extremes created a constant cycle of urgency. Climate conditions during the Viking Age, roughly from the late 8th century to the mid-11th century, was shaped by what historians and climatologists now refer to as a medieval warm period. This era, spanning approximately 800 to 1300 CE, brought relatively milder conditions to parts of northern Europe compared to earlier centuries. Yet, mild was relative. Even during this period, winters were severe by modern standards. Storms lashed the coasts, snow piled high in valleys, and seas often froze near the fjords. Norway, with its steep mountains and narrow fjords, posed constant challenges. Arable land was scarce, forcing communities to cling to the thin strips of fertile soil along the coastlines. Sweden, with its dense forests and inland lakes, provided more space for agriculture, but winters still bit deeply, often locking villages in ice. Denmark, with flatter terrain, was somewhat milder but vulnerable to strong winds and storms rolling off the North Sea. Iceland, settled by Norse explorers in the late 9th century, offered some fertile volcanic soil, but its unpredictable volcanic activity and glacial outbursts made survival precarious. The climate was not simply an environmental backdrop. It dictated every decision. Food had to be grown, gathered, or hunted in the short summer season. Crops like barley and rye were planted with precision, harvested quickly, and stored in preparation for the long freeze. Animals were slaughtered before winter to reduce the strain of feeding herds, with meat smoked, salted, or dried for preservation. Those who failed to prepare adequately often faced famine. The cold was not only a matter of discomfort, it was lethal. Without modern heating, the body was constantly at war with the elements. Exposure could lead to frostbite or death within hours. Inside settlements, families huddled together around central hearths, and the architecture of their homes reflected the pressing need to trap and conserve every scrap of heat. It is within this unforgiving environment that the turf house would later emerge as one of the most remarkable architectural solutions of its time. But beyond survival, the landscape shaped identity. The Norse sagas, written centuries later but rooted in oral tradition, frequently reference snow, storms, and the fury of natural forces. The gods themselves were tied to the elements. Thor, the thunder god, embodied the raw power of storms. Njord, god of the sea, was invoked for safe passage across icy waters. The harsh environment was more than a backdrop. It was a living presence in their worldview, a force that demanded respect and inspired reverence. Trade and raiding, so often associated with Viking history, were also born from environmental necessity. Scandinavian soil could not support large-scale agriculture, and long winters meant local resources were never enough. To sustain their communities, Norsemen turned outward, crossing seas to trade for grain, timber, and luxuries. When trade was not possible, raiding filled the gap. The Viking expansion across Europe, stretching from the British Isles to the Mediterranean, can in many ways be traced back to the cold, dark winters of the north and the scarcity they imposed. The landscape itself created isolation. In winter months, many settlements were cut off, their fjords frozen and mountain passes blocked with snow. Families endured months with little contact outside their immediate households. Archaeological evidence suggests that longhouses, which sheltered entire extended families, were as much about preserving social cohesion as they were about warmth. In these months of isolation, oral storytelling, craftwork, and communal feasting became essential forms of cultural survival. Waterways, too, played a dual role in the Scandinavian struggle with nature. The sea was both highway and hazard. While frozen seas trapped ships in harbors, thawed seasons opened the world to exploration. Yet storms were fierce, and countless Viking ships were lost to the waves. Rivers and fjords, carved by glacier, shaped settlement patterns and became lifelines of fishing, trade, and communication. Ice and fire, land and sea. Every element of the landscape demanded adaptation. The geography of Scandinavia also shaped political structures. Small pockets of arable land led to fragmented settlements, each governed by local chieftains. Harsh winters fostered independence but also cooperation, as neighbors sometimes relied on one another in times of scarcity. The Viking Age political system, built on assemblies known as things, reflected this balance, a culture where communities had to manage conflict and cooperation within the limits of the land. Even burial practices reflected the code. Archaeologists have uncovered graves where bodies were interred with tools, weapons, and food, reminders that even in death, the journey continued into an unknown afterlife where survival might again depend on preparation. Some of these graves were preserved by permafrost, offering modern researchers extraordinary insights into the diet, clothing, and health of the Norse. The struggle against the environment was constant, but it also forged resilience. Viking expansion to Iceland in the late 9th century was itself a testament to their ability to adapt. Iceland's volcanic soil allowed for farming, but settlers faced immediate challenges from ash falls, glacial floods, and bitter cold. Greenland, settled around 985 CE by Eric the Red, pushed human endurance even further. There, Norse communities carved out fragile existences, raising livestock and trading walrus ivory, but their survival was always precarious on the edge of the Arctic. The very word Viking is often associated with raiding and warfare, yet at its core, it represents a culture born of endurance. To live in Scandinavia during the Viking Age was to live in a land of extremes, long nights without sun, sudden storms at sea, and terrain that resisted cultivation. But rather than succumb, the Norse people built a society that embraced the challenge, creating technologies, traditions, and cultural systems designed to endure where many others might have faltered. In this land of ice and fire, necessity became the mother of innovation. The environment shaped their ships, their homes, their clothing, their diet, and their worldview. It is impossible to understand the Vikings without first understanding the elemental forces of the North, forces that tested them constantly and demanded responses that would shape one of the most remarkable cultures in human history. Long before the Vikings mastered the art of building with earth, their ancestors struggled to survive with shelters that were far less forgiving. To understand the innovation of turf houses, it is essential to look back at what came before, the early homes of Scandinavia. These structures reveal how generations of people experimented with wood, stone, and animal materials, gradually learning from failure, adapting to their environment, and moving toward the durable turf traditions that would one day define Norse survival. Archaeological evidence shows that the earliest Scandinavian shelters date back thousands of years, long before the Viking Age. During the Late Stone Age and Early Bronze Age, Roughly 2500 to 1000 BCE, small farming communities began to settle permanently in Scandinavia. These communities initially lived in pit houses, shallow dugouts lined with wooden roof with branches, turf, or hides. The floors were often sunk into the earth for insulation, while walls were low and primitive. Although these structures offered some shelter, they were cramped and vulnerable to moisture, pests, and collapse under snow. As societies advanced into the late Bronze Age and Iron Age, communities expanded into longhouses. These were elongated wooden structures that could stretch 20 to 75 meters in length. Built of timber with thatched roofs, longhouses were multi-purpose. Families, livestock, and storage all shared the same building. This design maximized warmth, as the body heat of animals added to the heat from central hearths. Evidence of such longhouses have been excavated at sites like Bo in Norway and Apaka in Sweden, showing the transition to more organized settlements. Yet timber longhouses came with their own challenges. Scandinavia's forests provided abundant wood, but timber alone could not withstand the full weight of snow and the relentless winds of northern winters. Roofs often sagged or collapsed. Drafts swept through gaps in the walls. Fires were a constant hazard. Archaeological remains show repeated rebuilding, suggesting that many of these structures were temporary solutions rather than enduring shelters. In coastal areas, some communities experimented with stone foundations to stabilize their homes. Stone walls could resist wind, but they did little to insulate against the cold. Without thick coverings, heat quickly escaped. In some regions, stones were combined with wooden frameworks, creating sturdier bases but still leaving families at the mercy of long winters. The Norse reliance on timber also carried deeper consequences. Scandinavia's arable land was already limited, and deforestation for building material put additional pressure on the environment. In Norway especially, steep mountains left only narrow valleys with usable soil and wood. Communities often competed for resources, forcing many families to migrate or adapt to harsher lands. These conditions set the stage for architectural innovation. Daily life inside pre-turf shelters was harsh. The central hearth provided heat and light, but smoke from open fires filled the interior, staining walls and lungs alike. Without chimneys, smoke vented through roof openings or cracks, leaving many homes dark and suffocating. Winter brought weeks of confinement in these cramped spaces. Families, livestock, and supplies all occupied the same rooms. Diseases spread easily, and malnutrition was common during times of scarcity. Despite their limitations, these shelters were not without cultural importance. Longhouses became the social and political centers of Norse communities. Archaeological evidence from Denmark shows large, decorated halls used by chieftains for feasts, assemblies, and religious rites. These halls symbolized status and authority, but their wooden structures still offered little protection from nature's extremes. By the early century CE, Scandinavian builders had begun experimenting with partial turf coverings. Excavations in Jutland reveal homes with turf-lined walls, suggesting a transitional phase where communities recognized the insulating power of earth. This was not yet the fully developed turf house, but it was the beginning of an architectural revolution born out of necessity. The settlement of Iceland in the late 9th century highlighted the shortcomings of traditional timber and stone architecture. Iceland lacked the dense forests of mainland Scandinavia, making timber scarce. Early settlers attempted to build wooden longhouses, but the shortage of material and the severity of Icelandic winters made these structures impractical. It was here that turf construction would become not just an innovation, but a cultural necessity. The evidence of what came before turf houses underscores a key truth. Viking ingenuity did not appear suddenly. It was a result of generations of trial and error. Families learned from collapsing roofs, freezing drafts, and smoke-filled rooms. They discovered that timber alone could not withstand the northern climate, nor could stone alone hold in warmth. Over time, these lessons pushed Norse builders toward the earth itself as the most reliable ally in their struggle for survival. In reflecting on these early shelters, historians see not only structures but the broader human struggle against an unforgiving environment. These homes were not simply places to live. They were arenas where survival was tested daily. Every storm that battered a wooden roof, every fire that consumed a hole, and every family forced to rebuild pushed the Norse closer to the breakthrough of turf architecture. Without these failures, the great innovation of the Viking turf house may never have taken shape. The story of Viking homes, therefore, is not only about the brilliance of turf construction, but about the long road that led to it. Before the turf house, there was trial and error, vulnerability, and resilience. It was a process of learning to listen to the land, to use wood, stone, and earth not as separate resources, but in combination. The houses that came before were imperfect, but they were essential stepping stones toward one of the most remarkable survival technologies of the Viking Age. The emergence of turf architecture was not a sudden invention, but a gradual transformation, born from centuries of struggle against the northern climate. The Vikings and their ancestors had long experimented with wood, stone, and simple earth linings. Yet it was only when necessity collided with ingenuity that a true architectural revolution began, the building of homes not merely upon the land, but out of it. The origins of turf houses are closely tied to the environmental realities of Scandinavia and the North Atlantic. By the late Iron Age, roughly between 500 and 800 CE, communities across Norway, Denmark, and Sweden had already discovered that earth, when layered properly, acted as one of the most effective insulators available. Archaeological traces suggest that some early longhouses were reinforced with sod walls or earth-packed foundations, hinting at a growing recognition of turf's potential. But it was the expansion into Iceland and Greenland that made turf architecture indispensable. When Norse settlers first arrived in Iceland around 870 CE, they faced a land that was both rich and unforgiving. Volcanic soil supported grass and livestock, but forests were sparse and quickly depleted. Within a few generations, large-scale deforestation made timber a scarce resource. Stone was available, but without insulation, stone houses were cold and uninhabitable in the long winters. Turf, however, was abundant. Thick mats of grass-covered soil could be cut into blocks and stacked like bricks, providing natural insulation and strength. It was in Iceland that turf construction matured from an occasional technique into a cultural standard. The process of turf building was ingenious. Builders began by selecting land with thick, dense turf. Using sharp iron or wooden tools, they cut sods into rectangular or triangular blocks, often 30 to 50 centimeters thick. These were then stacked in interlocking patterns, much like stone masonry, to form thick outer walls. Inside, timber framework supported the roof, but the turf itself provided the crucial insulation. Roofs were layered with birch bark for waterproofing, then covered with additional turf, blending the structure seamlessly into the landscape. From a distance, a completed turf house often looked like a grassy mound rising naturally from the earth. The advantages of turf were immediate and profound. Walls sometimes reached a thickness of 1 meter, trapping heat during the winter and keeping interiors cool in the summer. Turf was also remarkably durable, able to withstand heavy snowfalls and strong winds. Unlike timber, which required constant maintenance, turf renewed itself as grass continued to grow on the outer layers. The result was a living, breathing structure that was both sustainable and effective. These turf houses were not uniform. Regional variations reflected the diversity of landscapes and available materials. In Iceland, where timber was scarce, turf walls dominated construction, with only minimal wood use for interior frameworks. In Greenland, settlers combined turf with stone foundations, adapting to rocky terrain and harsher climates. In Norway, where timber remained more accessible, turf often supplemented wooden structures rather than replacing them entirely. This adaptability made turf architecture one of the most versatile and enduring building traditions in the Norse world. Archaeological sites provide vivid evidence of this transformation. At Kelder in southern Iceland, one of the oldest surviving turf farmsteads, Remnants of medieval turf houses reveal thick, grass-covered walls, narrow entrances, and long corridors leading into central halls. Excavations at Glomber, another preserved turf settlement in northern Iceland, show how entire farm complexes were built from turf, including living quarters, barns, and storage rooms. These sites demonstrate the sophistication of turf architecture, which was not limited to single-family dwellings but extended into large communal and agricultural complexes. The birth of turf architecture also marked a profound shift in the relationship between humans and their environment. Unlike timber houses, which stood apart from the land, turf houses merged with it. They were camouflaged against the hillsides, protected from the wind, and thermally balanced with the soil. In many ways, these structures embody the Norse philosophy of adaptation, survival not through domination of nature, but through cooperation with it. The cultural significance of turf houses grew alongside their practicality. They became symbols of permanence and resilience in a world defined by harsh seasons and constant movement. For Viking farmers, building with turf meant more than constructing a shelter. It meant establishing a lineage tied to the land. Farms were handed down through generations, and turf houses stood as living monuments to the endurance of families who had tamed the northern frontier. Yet the innovation was not without challenges. Turf houses required constant upkeep. Walls had to be repaired as sod decayed, roofs reseeded with grass, and drainage maintained to prevent collapse. The interiors were dark, with small openings for light and ventilation. Smoke from central hearths lingered inside, blackening rafters and filling lungs. But despite these drawbacks, turf houses provided something far more valuable than comfort: survival. The broader historical context also explains why turf architecture became so important in the Viking Age. From the late 8th century onward, Norse communities expanded across the North Atlantic, from the Shetland and Faroe Islands to Iceland, Greenland, and even Vinland in North America. These new settlements demanded adaptability. Timber could not always be imported from Scandinavia, and local resources varied widely. Turf, however, was nearly universal across the North Atlantic. By mastering turf construction, the Vikings ensured that their culture could spread and survive in some of the most inhospitable regions of the known world. Written sources from later centuries confirmed the prominence of turf houses in daily life. The Icelandic sagas, recorded in the 13th and 14th centuries, describe households and chieftains' halls that align closely with archaeological evidence of turf construction. These texts reveal that turf houses were not just ordinary dwellings, but also centers of social and political life. Feasts, legal assemblies, and storytelling all unfolded within their thick walls, reinforcing the role of turf houses as both practical shelters and cultural arenas. By the 10th century, turf architecture had become the dominant form of housing across Iceland and parts of Greenland. Its success lay not in luxury but in necessity. Where wood failed and stone faltered, turf prevailed. The structures were imperfect, often damp and smoky, but they kept families alive through endless winters and preserved a culture that might otherwise have perished in the cold. The birth of turf architecture marks one of the most significant yet often overlooked innovations of the Viking Age. While ships carried them across seas and weapons secured their fame abroad, it was turf houses that sustained their lives at home. These earth-built structures reveal the quieter, domestic side of Norse resilience, the ingenuity of farmers and builders who, faced with the relentless forces of ice and wind, turned the land itself into shelter. The emergence of turf architecture was not a sudden invention, but a gradual transformation, born from centuries of struggle against the northern climate. The Vikings and their ancestors had long experimented with wood, stone, and simple earth linings. Yet it was only when necessity collided with ingenuity that a true architectural revolution began. The building of homes not merely upon the land, but out of it. The origins of turf houses are closely tied to the environmental realities of Scandinavia and the North Atlantic. By the late Iron Age, roughly between 500 and 800 CE, communities across Norway, Denmark, and Sweden had already discovered that earth, when layered properly, acted as one of the most effective insulators available. Archaeological traces suggest that some early longhouses were reinforced with sod walls or earth-packed foundations, hinting at a growing recognition of turf's potential. But it was the expansion into Iceland and Greenland that made turf architecture indispensable. When Norse settlers first arrived in Iceland around 870 CE, they faced a land that was both rich and unforgiving. Volcanic soil supported grass and livestock, but forests were sparse and quickly depleted. Within a few generations, large-scale deforestation made timber a scarce resource. Stone was available, but without insulation, stone houses were cold and uninhabitable in the long winters. Turf, however, was abundant. Thick mats of grass-covered soil could be cut into blocks and stacked like bricks, providing natural insulation and strength. It was in Iceland that turf construction matured from an occasional technique into a cultural standard. The process of turf building was ingenious. Builders began by selecting land with thick, dense turf. Using sharp iron or wooden tools, they cut sods into rectangular or triangular blocks, often 30 to 50 centimeters thick. These were then stacked in interlocking patterns, much like stone masonry, to form thick outer walls. Inside, timber framework supported the roof, but the turf itself provided the crucial insulation. Roofs were layered with birch bark for waterproofing, then covered with additional turf, blending the structure seamlessly into the landscape. From a distance, a completed turf house often looked like a grassy mound rising naturally from the earth. The advantages of turf were immediate and profound. Walls sometimes reached a thickness of 1 meter, trapping heat during the winter and keeping interiors cool in the summer. Turf was also remarkably durable, able to withstand heavy snowfalls and strong winds. Unlike timber, which required constant maintenance, turf renewed itself as grass continued to grow on the outer layers. The result was a living, breathing structure that was both sustainable and effective. These turf houses were not uniform. Regional variations reflected the diversity of landscapes and available materials. In Iceland, where timber was scarce, turf walls dominated construction, with only minimal wood use for interior frameworks. In Greenland, settlers combined turf with stone foundations, adapting to rocky terrain and harsher climates. In Norway, where timber remained more accessible, turf often supplemented wooden structures rather than replacing them entirely. This adaptability made turf architecture one of the most versatile and enduring building traditions in the Norse world. Archaeological sites provide vivid evidence of this transformation. At Keldur in southern Iceland, one of the oldest surviving turf farmsteads, remnants of medieval turf houses reveal thick, grass-covered walls, narrow entrances, and long corridors leading into central halls. Excavations at Glomber, another preserved turf settlement in northern Iceland, show how entire farm complexes were built from turf, including living quarters, barns, and storage rooms. These sites demonstrate the sophistication of turf architecture, which was not limited to single-family dwellings but extended into large communal and agricultural complexes. The birth of turf architecture also marked a profound shift in the relationship between humans and their environment. Unlike timber houses, which stood apart from the land, turf houses merged with it. They were camouflaged against the hillsides, protected from the wind, and thermally balanced with the soil. In many ways, these structures embodied the Norse philosophy of adaptation, survival not through domination of nature, but through cooperation with it. The cultural significance of turf houses grew alongside their practicality. They became symbols of permanence and resilience in a world defined by harsh seasons and constant movement. For Viking farmers, building with turf meant more than constructing a shelter. It meant establishing a lineage tied to the land. Farms were handed down through generations, and turf houses stood as living monuments to the endurance of families who had tamed the northern frontier. Yet the innovation was not without challenges. Turf houses required constant upkeep. Walls had to be repaired as sod decayed, roofs reseeded with grass, and drainage maintained to prevent collapse. The interiors were dark, with small openings for light and ventilation. Smoke from central hearths lingered inside, blackening rafters and filling lungs. But despite these drawbacks, turf houses provided something far more valuable than comfort: survival. The broader historical context also explains why turf architecture became so important in the Viking Age. From the late 8th century onward, Norse communities expanded across the North Atlantic, from the Shetland and Faroe Islands to Iceland, Greenland, and even Vinland in North America. These new settlements demanded adaptability. Timber could not always be imported from Scandinavia, and local resources varied widely. Turf, however, was nearly universal across the North Atlantic. By mastering turf construction, the Vikings ensured that their culture could spread and survive in some of the most inhospitable regions of the known world. Written sources from later centuries confirm the prominence of turf houses in daily life. The Icelandic sagas, recorded in the 13th and 14th centuries, describe households and chieftains' halls that align closely with archaeological evidence of turf construction. These texts reveal that turf houses were not just ordinary dwellings, but also centers of social and political life. Feasts, legal assemblies, and storytelling all unfolded within their thick walls, reinforcing the role of turf houses as both practical shelters and cultural arenas. By the 10th century, turf architecture had become the dominant form of housing across Iceland and parts of Greenland. Its success lay not in luxury but in necessity. Where wood failed and stone faltered, turf prevailed. The structures were imperfect, often damp and smoky, but they kept families alive through endless winters and preserved a culture that might otherwise have perished in the cold. The birth of turf architecture marks one of the most significant yet often overlooked innovations of the Viking Age. While ships carried them across seas and weapons secured their fame abroad, it was turf houses that sustained their lives at home. These earth-built structures reveal the quieter, domestic side of Norse resilience, the ingenuity of farmers and builders who, faced with the relentless forces of ice and wind, turned the land itself into shelter. The Viking turf house was more than shelter. It was a machine for survival, engineered to trap heat in a world where winter could last for more than half a year. To understand how entire families endured inside these earth-built structures, we must look closely at the very walls themselves. They were not crude piles of sod, as one might imagine, but carefully layered systems of earth, stone, and wood, designed with an intuitive grasp of insulation that rivaled anything in pre-modern Europe. The first principle of turf walls was mass. A good turf wall could measure up to a meter in thickness. Archaeologists studying preserved turf houses in Iceland and Greenland have confirmed that the average wall often contained 2 or 3 separate layers: an outer shell of tightly cut turf blocks, an inner lining of stone or timber, and a core of packed earth or additional turf. This combination created walls that were dense enough to hold heat yet flexible enough to resist collapse under snow. The insulating properties of turf come from its composition. Sod, when cut from healthy grasslands, contains a thick mat of roots, soil, and organic matter. These natural fibers bind the block together, while the soil traps tiny pockets of air. Air is a poor conductor of heat, and so turf, like modern insulation materials, work by reducing heat loss through conduction. Modern experiments with reconstructed turf walls have shown that, even in freezing conditions, temperatures inside remain stable, often 10 to 15 degrees warmer than outside. But the brilliance of turf walls lay not only in heat retention, but in their ability to breathe. Unlike solid stone, which traps moisture, turf is porous. Moisture from cooking, breathing, and the hearth's fire could slowly pass through the walls rather than condensing inside. This reduced dampness, though it did not eliminate it completely. Families still battled mold and musty air, but without the porous turf, interiors would have become unlivable swamps of condensation. The very fact that turf absorbed and released moisture gradually helped create a balance that made long-term habitation possible. Builders refined these techniques over centuries. Excavations at Kelda, one of Iceland's oldest turf farms, reveal walls constructed with alternating layers of flat turf blocks placed in herringbone patterns. This interlocking system prevented the walls from shifting under their own weight and increased stability against frost heave, the expansion and contraction of soil caused by freezing and thawing. Other sites, such as Glomber, show double wall designs, where two parallel turf walls were filled with earth or gravel in between, creating a primitive but highly effective form of cavity wall insulation. At the base of the walls, stone foundations were essential. Turf laid directly on the ground would rot quickly. By raising the first course of sod onto a stone footing, builders created a barrier against ground moisture. Stones also provided stability, preventing the heavy wall from sinking unevenly into the soil. Many preserved turf houses still reveal these stone bases, which often outlasted the turf itself. The roof was an extension of the same principle. Turf roofs were constructed with layers of birch bark to repel water, covered by thick mats of sod. Like the walls, these roofs were heavy, sometimes weighing several tons. Timber beams had to be carefully placed to carry the load, yet when properly built, the roof became an additional insulating layer. Grass continued to grow on top, and from a distance, the house disappeared into the hillside, camouflaged by its living roof. The result was a structure uniquely suited to the northern climate. Winds howled outside, snow buried the landscape, and temperatures plunged below freezing. Yet inside, the turf house remained habitable. Warmth radiated from the central hearth and lingered in the thick walls. Archaeological reconstruction suggests that while interiors were not comfortable by modern standards, they were survivable. Families could cook, sleep, and work without constant threat of frostbite or exposure. The ability of turf walls to regulate temperature also shaped the rhythm of daily life. In winter, people gathered in the central hall, where the walls trapped heat from both the fire and human bodies. In summer, the same walls kept interiors cool, protecting food stores from spoilage and offering relief from the brief but sometimes intense northern sun. Turf houses, in effect, created their own microclimate, one that made year-round habitation possible in regions that might otherwise have been abandoned. The science of turf walls also helps explain why Viking settlements could survive in some of the harshest corners of the known world. In Greenland, where winters were longer and colder than in mainland Scandinavia, turf walls made a difference between endurance and collapse. Excavations at sites like Bratteli, the estate of Eric the Red, reveal large turf structures built with extraordinary care, their thick walls still visible after 1,000 years. Without these walls, Norse Greenlanders could never have sustained their fragile colony on the edge of the Arctic. Written sources confirm the importance of these homes. Medieval Icelandic sagas describe life inside turf houses, with frequent references to the hearth, the smoke-filled halls, and the sheltering walls. The sagas rarely romanticize these interiors. They were cramped, dark, and difficult, but they also acknowledge them as a backdrop for feasts, assemblies, and the telling of epic stories. In the warmth of these walls, culture and memory were preserved as much as human life. The endurance of turf walls was not without cost. They required constant maintenance. Grass roofs needed reseeding, eroded sods had to be replaced, and drainage ditches had to be cleared to prevent collapse. A neglected turf house could decay within a decade, but a well-maintained one could stand for generations. This cycle of repair and renewal became part of Norse identity. Families were not just living in houses. They were tending to living structures, part of the same natural world that both threatened and sustained them. In comparing Viking turf houses with other contemporary dwellings across Europe, their uniqueness becomes even clearer. While stone castles rose in Britain and timber halls stood in continental Europe, the Norse built homes that were humble, dark, and earthy. Yet in terms of thermal performance, few medieval European homes could match the insulating power of turf. The Vikings may not have built monuments of grandeur, but they built monuments of endurance, houses that breathed warmth into the coldest of nights. The story of turf walls is not just about architecture. It is about survival against overwhelming odds. These walls absorbed the breath of families, the smoke of countless fires, and the echoes of sagas told in the long dark winters. They were more than barriers of sword and stone. They were vessels of memory and resilience, carrying forward a culture that might otherwise have frozen into silence. At the center of every Viking turf house stood its most essential feature, the hearth. More than a fireplace, it was the beating heart of the longhouse, the place where survival, culture, and community converged. In the harsh climate of Scandinavia in the North Atlantic, the hearth was life itself. It provided heat in the dead of winter, light in the endless dark, and fire for cooking meals that kept families alive. Around its flames, sagas were told, alliances were forged, and spiritual traditions were observed. To understand Viking domestic life, one must step into the smoke-filled hall and stand before the fire at its center. The longhouse was organized around the hearth. Archaeological excavations from Norway to Iceland consistently reveal central fire pits running down the length of these structures. Typically, the hearth was placed in the middle of the main hall, often a rectangular stone-lined pit filled with ash, charcoal, and burnt bone. Some larger longhouses contain multiple hearths, spaced along the interior to provide heat to extended areas. Evidence from sites such as Borge in Lofoten, Norway, one of the largest Viking longhouses ever discovered, shows how the placement of hearth structured the building itself, dividing it into zones for cooking, sleeping, and gathering. The fire provided the only consistent source of heat. In the depths of winter, when temperatures fell below freezing for months at a time, the hearth became the difference between survival and death. Its flames radiated outward, warming the thick turf walls that trapped heat inside. Families slept close to the hearth, sometimes on raised wooden platforms along the walls, benefiting from both the heat of the fire and the insulation of animal furs. Livestock often shared the longhouse as well, their body heat adding to the warmth. Cooking was another central function. The Norse diet relied heavily on grains like barley, rye, and oats, which were boiled into thick porridges or baked into flatbreads using heated stones. Meat, when available, was roasted or stewed in iron cauldrons suspended over the fire. Fish, a staple in coastal settlements, was grilled or dried over low flames. Archaeological finds of charred food remains, burned bones, and cooking tools provide a vivid picture of these daily meals. In an age without refrigeration, preservation methods such as smoking and drying often relied directly on the hearth. But the hearth was more than practical. It was symbolic. In Norse cosmology, fire was a sacred force. The myth of the world creation describes fire and ice as the primal elements whose clash gave birth to existence itself. To the Vikings, fire was both dangerous and divine, a source of life that demanded respect. Rituals were often conducted around the hearth, from offerings of food and drink to the gods, to rites marking births, marriages, and deaths. The hearth linked the family to the wider spiritual order of the cosmos. The smoke that filled the longhouse was a constant companion. Without chimneys, smoke vented slowly through roof openings or drifted through cracks in the turf. Visitors from outside the Norse world often remarked on the dark, hazy interiors of Scandinavian houses. For the inhabitants, this was simply part of life. Over time, the rafters blackened, and the smell of smoke became ingrained in clothing, tools, and even hair. While unpleasant, the smoke also served a purpose. It helped preserve wooden beams, deter insects, and cure hanging meats and fish. The hearth was also the stage for storytelling. Long winters trapped families indoors for months at a time, and in those hours of confinement, oral tradition flourished. Sagas, myths, and genealogies were recited by firelight, passed down from generation to generation. These tales preserved history, explained the cosmos, and bound communities together with a shared sense of identity. The very structure of Norse memory, the epics that would later be written in Icelandic sagas, was nurtured by the flickering light of the hearth. Beyond family life, the hearth played a role in politics and social order. In larger halls, such as those of chieftains or kings, The central fire became the focal point of feasting and assembly. Here, warriors gathered around the flames to share food and drink, pledge loyalty, and plan raids or expeditions. Feasts held around the hearth reinforced hierarchies, with seating arrangements reflecting social status. Archaeological finds of high-status drinking vessels, imported glassware, and ornate metalwork from whole sites highlight the symbolic weight of these gatherings. The hearth was both the literal and metaphorical center of power. In Iceland, where sagas were later written down, descriptions of feasts and assemblies frequently highlight the firelit halls as a backdrop for dramatic events. Whether celebrating victories or negotiating disputes, the longhouse hearth provided the stage for moments that defined communities. Firelight illuminated the faces of men and women whose decisions shaped the fate of farms, families, and even nations. Daily rhythms were structured by the hearth as well. Fires had to be tended constantly. In winter, they burned day and night, with family members taking turns feeding logs, peat, or dried dung to keep the flames alive. Letting the hearth go cold was dangerous, forcing families to restart fires in bitter conditions. Ashes were carefully managed, both for cleanliness and for symbolic reasons. In some traditions, ashes from the hearth were considered protective, spread over fields or placed near doorways to ward off misfortune. The construction of hearths reflected this importance. Many were lined with stone slabs to contain heat and prevent fire from spreading to the turf walls. Some had raised platforms or stone surrounds for cooking, while others included simple clay or stone stoves. Archaeological evidence from Greenland shows adaptations to extreme cold, with deeper hearth pits designed to radiate more heat. Each variation reveals the central role of fire in Norse ingenuity. The hearth also connected the living to the dead. In Norse belief, ancestors remained present in the home, watching over their descendants. Offerings of food or drink were sometimes cast into the fire as gestures of remembrance. The hearth thus became a bridge across generations, where family history and spiritual tradition converged. Despite its centrality, the hearth also carried risks. Fire, if uncontrolled, could destroy an entire longhouse. Thick turf walls resisted flame, but wooden interiors and thatched roofs were vulnerable. Archaeological records are evidence of burned structures, a reminder that the same element that gave life could also take it away. Families lived with this constant awareness, balancing necessity with caution. By the later medieval period, as chimneys and improved ventilation spread in Europe, Norse hearth traditions evolved. But during the Viking Age, the hearth remained simple, central, and symbolic. It was a defining feature of domestic life, shaping everything from daily meals to cosmology, from social order to oral tradition. The heart of the longhouse was not merely a place where fire burned. It was the axis around which Viking life turned. In its light, families endured the endless night. In its heat, cultures thrived against the cold. And in its smoke, the memory of a people was carried forward, preserved in sagas that still echo today. The Viking turf house was never only about survival for an individual family. It was about something larger, survival of the community. These structures, with their thick sod walls and smoky interiors, were the physical backbone of Norse society. They were not just homes, but meeting places, farms, and centers of social order. Within their grassy walls, families forged bonds, neighbors relied on one another, and entire communities organized themselves to endure in one of the most unforgiving climates on earth. The architecture community began with the longhouse itself. In many Norse settlements, longhouses were designed to accommodate extended families, parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes even cousins or unrelated labors under the same roof. Archaeological remains from sites like Borg in Lofoten, Norway, and Eiríksstaðir in Iceland reveal immense longhouses stretching up to 80 meters in length. These were not simple dwellings. They were sprawling halls that acted as miniature villages under a single roof. The design of these longhouses reflected the collective nature of Norse life. The central hall provided space not only for cooking and warmth, but also for communal gatherings. along the sides. Sleeping platforms lined the walls, allowing many people to rest in the same space. Animals, too, were often housed within the longhouse during the winter, their body heat adding to the warmth and their presence further blurring the line between domestic and communal life. In this way, architecture itself encouraged cooperation and interdependence. Beyond the single family, turf house settlements often grew into farmsteads with multiple buildings linked together. Excavations at Glomber in northern Iceland reveal complexes of interconnected turf structures, living quarters, barns, food storage rooms, and workshops, all joined by narrow passageways. This design allowed entire communities to function as one during the winter months, moving between spaces without exposure to the freezing winds. These farmsteads were more than clusters of houses. They were architectural expressions of social unity. The communal labor required to build and maintain turf houses further reinforced this sense of togetherness. Cutting sod blocks, stacking walls, and repairing roofs were not tasks for one family alone. Neighbors often worked side by side in construction and upkeep, strengthening bonds that would be essential during times of famine, illness, or conflict. Historians studying Norse society note that cooperation in building was closely tied to the Norse concept of félag, or fellowship, the idea that survival depended on shared effort. Inside the turf houses, daily routines also carried a communal rhythm. Meals were prepared in shared spaces and eaten together. Children learned skills by watching and imitating adults, weaving, carving, preserving food, or tending animals. Elders contributed wisdom, often in the form of oral tradition and storytelling. The architecture, by bringing so many lives under one roof, created a setting where knowledge, culture, and labor were continuously passed from one generation to the next. Feasting was one of the most powerful communal activities, and turf houses provided the stage for it. Archaeological finds of large cooking pits, high-status drinking vessels, and animal bones at whole sites indicate that major communal meals took place inside these structures. Feasts were not only about food, but about reaffirming alliances, distributing wealth, and demonstrating the status of chieftains. In such moments, the architecture of the longhouse was transformed into the architecture of politics. The size of the hall, the position of the hearth, and the arrangement of seating all reflected the hierarchy of the community. The role of turf houses in law and governance was equally important. In Iceland, where the Althing, one of the world's oldest parliaments, was established in 930 CE, local gatherings known as things were often hosted at chieftains' halls. Disputes were negotiated, agreements sealed, and justice administered within or around these turf structures. The architecture was thus not only functional but also political, embodying the power and authority of local leaders. Religion and ritual also found a place within these earthen walls. While large public ceremonies might be held outdoors at sacred sites, many smaller rituals took place within turf houses. Offerings to household gods and ancestors, rites of passage, and seasonal celebrations were woven into domestic life. The hearth often served as a spiritual focus, but the entire house, built from living earth and tied to the land, carried symbolic weight. For many Norse families, the turf house was not just a shelter but a sacred space that connected them to both gods and kin. The communal role of turf houses extended even to times of crisis. In harsh winters, neighbors sometimes gathered in larger halls for shared survival. During famines, food was redistributed from storage rooms within farmsteads. Archaeological evidence of shared storage pits suggests that communities pooled resources as a hedge against disaster. In this sense, the turf house became a physical embodiment of mutual reliance, walls that held not only families but entire networks of support. It is also worth noting the gendered spaces that turf houses created. Women often controlled the domestic sphere, overseeing food preparation, textile production, and household management within the longhouse. Men, while responsible for farming, hunting, and raiding, also spent long hours indoors during the winter, crafting tools and weapons. The shared architecture meant that gendered roles were visible and overlapping, reinforcing both cooperation and hierarchy within the community. Comparisons with other European societies of the same period highlight the uniqueness of this architecture community. While feudal manners in Western Europe divided lords and peasants into separate spaces, Norse turf houses brought different classes of people closer together under common roofs. Chieftains and the boors lived in proximity, their lives overlapping in ways that emphasized shared survival. The turf house blurred distinctions of status more than stone castles or timber halls elsewhere in medieval Europe. The endurance of turf houses as centers of community life can still be seen in the preserved sites of Iceland. At Glomber, the interconnected turf structures reveal a society where every activity, from milking cows to storing grain, from telling stories to resolving disputes, was bound within the same earthen walls. At Kelda, the long passageways linking multiple buildings show how architecture physically connected people, creating communities that could withstand the isolation of Arctic winters. The architecture community reflected the Norse worldview. Life was fragile, survival precarious, and no one could endure alone. The walls of turf houses were therefore more than insulation. They were boundaries of fellowship. Inside them, families became communities, and communities became societies capable of exploration, trade, and conquest. Without these communal structures, the Norse could never have sustained their presence across the North Atlantic or projected their influence into the wider world. In the end, the architecture community was about more than buildings. It was about the way space was used to bind people together, to teach, to govern, to feast, and to endure. The Viking turf house, humble and earthen though it was, became a monument to cooperation, a reminder that survival in the North was never an individual achievement but a collective one. For the Vikings, the most dangerous enemy of all was not the sword or the storm. It was the darkness. In the far north, winter was not measured in weeks of cold, but in months of shadow. From October through May, snow and ice blanketed the land, while in the northern reaches, the sun disappeared altogether for long stretches of time. Life inside the turf house became a battle not just against hunger and frost, but against the psychological weight of endless night. The geography of Scandinavia and the North Atlantic dictated this rhythm. In regions near the Arctic Circle, northern Norway, Iceland, and especially Greenland, the sun dipped below the horizon in late autumn and did not rise again for weeks. Even in southern Scandinavia, daylight hours were reduced to just a few dim hours at midday. Archaeological evidence and written sources alike confirm how profoundly this seasonal cycle shaped Norse life. The very architecture of turf houses, dark, enclosed, and centered on the hearth, was an answer to these long months of darkness. Inside, the hearth fire became the sole source of light. Archaeological reconstructions of Viking interiors show just how dim these homes would have been. Smoke drifted from open fires, staining rafters and walls, while small lamps made from carved stone or clay added faint illumination. These lamps burned fish oil, seal oil, or animal fat, producing more smell than brightness. The flicker of these flames created shadows that danced across the turf walls, leaving the interior in perpetual twilight. The lack of light profoundly shaped daily life. Activities that required vision, such as weaving, carving, or tool-making, had to be performed near the hearth or postponed until spring. Children grew up in dim conditions that modern eyes would find nearly intolerable. Yet within this world of shadow, the Vikings adapted. Tasks were adjusted to the season. Winter became a time for indoor labor, repairing tools, weaving textiles, telling stories, and preserving food. The architecture, by compressing life into enclosed spaces, encouraged cooperation and collective endurance. The psychological burden of darkness is harder to measure, but no less real. Anthropologists studying Arctic communities today describe how extended darkness can bring fatigue, depression, and disorientation, conditions modern science refers to as seasonal affective disorder. While the Vikings had no such medical terminology, their sagas and traditions hint at the struggle. References to hardship, endurance, and the testing of spirit are frequent in Norse literature. These were not abstract concepts. They reflected lived experience. Isolation magnified the weight of darkness. For months, families were confined within their turf houses, often cut off from neighboring settlements by snow and impassable terrain. The claustrophobia of these conditions was broken only by communal feasts, storytelling, or the occasional visit from neighbors brave enough to cross the winter landscape. Archaeological remains of interconnected turf structures, passage houses linking barns, stores, and halls, show how architecture itself helped reduce the isolation, creating indoor communities where people could move between spaces without stepping into the night. Darkness also intensified the role of oral tradition. In the absence of written records or external entertainment, stories became the lifeblood of winter. By the firelight, sagas were told and retold, myths of gods and giants, tales of ancestors, and legends of distant voyages. The darkness became a canvas of memory and imagination, where the voices of elders preserved identity. Scholars believe that the sagas, later written down in medieval Iceland, were refined during these long winters, the poetic structures polished by repetition in the dim halls of turf houses. Yet living in darkness was not only a trial, it also reinforced resilience. Families learned to endure hardship as a matter of routine. The scarcity of light made fire sacred, strengthening its symbolic role in Norse cosmology. The cycle of darkness and light was mirrored in myth. The endless winter of Fimbulwinter, the coming of Ragnarok, and the promise of renewal and the rebirth of the world. The Vikings did not simply endure darkness. They wove it into their worldview, finding meaning in its challenge. Material evidence of adaptation is also revealing. Archaeologists have found lampstones carved with shallow depressions, filled with oil and fitted with moss or plant fibers as wicks. These were simple but effective, extending the reach of light just enough for small tasks. Animal skins, stretched thin and used as window coverings, allowed faint daylight to filter in while keeping out cold winds. These small innovations show a people who confronted darkness not with despair but with practical ingenuity. Religious and ritual practices help communities cope as well. Seasonal festivals, such as Jol, Yule, celebrated in midwinter, broke the monotony with feasting, drinking, and ritual observances. Yule was not only about marking the solstice, it was about reassuring families that the sun would return, that the darkness would not last forever. These rituals, often held inside longhouses, reinforced hope and cohesion at the very moment when both were most needed. The strain of darkness was most acute in colonies at the edge of the Norse world. In Greenland, settlers endured some of the longest and harshest winters of any Norse community. Archaeological digs at Bratteli and other sites revealed turf houses with unusually thick walls, suggesting efforts to conserve heat during prolonged darkness. In Iceland, where volcanic eruptions occasionally added ash to already dim skies, the psychological burden was compounded by natural disasters. In such places, the turf house was more than architecture, it was a lifeline against despair. Interestingly, the Norse response to darkness was not simply to hide from it. They adapted their entire rhythm of life to its cycle. Summer, with its endless daylight, became a time of frantic activity, farming, fishing, raiding, and travel. Winter was a time of retreat, when communities withdrew into their turf houses, relying on stored supplies and inner strength. This duality shaped the Norse character, balancing aggression and endurance, outward expansion and inward survival. Modern reconstructions of turf houses allow us to experience, in some measure, the reality of living in darkness. Step inside, and the first impression is a dimness. The fire glows, but shadows dominate. The walls absorb light rather than reflect it. Outside, snow muffles all sound. It is easy to imagine the psychological weight of months spent in such conditions. Yet it is equally easy to see how communities bound together, leaning on one another, finding solace in shared warmth and story. Living in darkness left its imprint on Norse culture in enduring ways. It shaped myths of twilight and renewal, created traditions of storytelling and feasting, and produced an architecture uniquely designed for confinement and endurance. The turf house, with its thick walls and dim interior, was not simply a response to the cold. It was a response to the absence of light. In its smoky halls, the Vikings learned that survival was not only about food or shelter, but about hope, the belief that even the longest night would eventually end. For the Vikings, survival in the far north was never achieved by architecture alone. Even the thick walls of turf houses, designed to trap precious heat, were not enough without other strategies. Endurance through long winters depended on three fundamental pillars: the clothing that protected their bodies, the fire that kept their homes alive, and the food that sustained their strength. These were not luxuries but necessities, refined over centuries of trial and error, and they reveal as much about Norse ingenuity as their ships or weapons. Clothing was the first line of defense against the cold. Archaeological evidence from graves and settlements across Scandinavia and Norse colonies shows that garments were made from wool, linen, animal skins, and fur. Wool dominated Viking attire because it was abundant and versatile. Sheep thrived in the northern climate, and their wool could be spun into yarn, woven into cloth, and layered for warmth. Wool was naturally insulating, even when damp, making it the ideal material for life in a region where snow, sleet, and sea spray were constant companions. Women were the masters of textile production, working looms and spindles to create tunics, trousers, cloaks, and undergarments. Cloaks fastened with brooches or pins were particularly vital, offering warmth and adaptability. Fur enhanced these garments further. Fox, beaver, bear, and wolf pelts lined cloaks and hoods, while in Greenland, where the cold was more extreme, settlers relied on seal and caribou skins. Caribou fur, with its hollow insulating haze, provided exceptional protection, rivaling the warmth of modern down. Boots lined with fur, mittens of leather, and hoods trimmed with animal skins turned clothing into a true armor against frostbite. Textiles carried meaning beyond survival as well. High-quality woolens marked wealth and craftsmanship, while imported silks and dyed fabrics, rare but prized, demonstrated connections to vast trade networks stretching across Europe and the Middle East. Yet even for the wealthiest, survival depended on the same principle as the poorest farmer: layering wool, fur, and leather to conserve body heat. The second pillar was fire, the element of life within the turf house. Archaeological excavations of Norse dwellings consistently reveal central hearths lined with stone and thick layers of ash and charcoal, proof of fires that burned endlessly through the winter. Fire was heat, light, and survival, but also a symbol of continuity. Without it, turf walls would quickly lose warmth, food would spoil, and life inside would collapse. Fuel sources varied depending on geography. In the forests of Norway and Sweden, pine, birch, and oak provided timber for burning. Families cut, split, and stored firewood in vast piles before winter arrived. But in Iceland and Greenland, where forests were scarce and quickly depleted, fire relied heavily on peat. Families cut blocks of decomposed plant matter from bogs, dried them, and stacked them for use. Peat burned slowly, producing steady heat and thick smoke. Animal fats and oils supplemented as fuel for lamps and smaller fires. Whale oil and seal blubber in particular were crucial in Greenland, where resources were scarce. Tending the fire was a daily and nightly responsibility. Families woke to stir the embers, carried coals to light lamps, and rationed fuel carefully to ensure the supply lasted until spring. Without fire, the darkness of winter would have been unendurable. But fire also carried danger. Wooden beams, that supports, and stored supplies could easily ignite. Archaeological evidence of burned ruins across Norse settlements stands as testimony to this ever-present risk. The hearth, as central as it was, demanded both respect and caution. The third and most essential pillar of survival was food. The Viking diet was shaped by the abundance of summer and the scarcity of winter, and the cycle of seasons forced families to become masters of preservation. agriculture provided the backbone of the diet. Barley, rye, and oats grew during the short northern summers and were harvested quickly before frost returned. Stored in pits, bins, or wooden containers inside turf houses, these grains were boiled into porridge, baked into flatbreads, or brewed into ale. Barley ale, a staple, was not just a drink but a safe and reliable source of hydration when fresh water was unavailable or frozen. Livestock provided another vital source of food. Cows, sheep, goats, pigs, and chickens were kept close to or even within the longhouse during winter. Their milk, meat, and egg were consumed fresh in summer and preserved for winter. The slaughter of livestock typically took place in late autumn, reducing the number of mouths to feed and ensuring that meat could be salted, dried, or smoked for long-term storage. Dairy was equally important. Butter, cheese, and skyr, a type of sour milk curd still eaten in Iceland today, added much-needed protein and fat to the diet. Archaeological finds of milk residue on pottery confirmed the widespread role of dairy in Viking subsistence. Fishing and hunting added critical variety and calories. Coastal communities depended heavily on cod, herring, and salmon, which were dried into stockfish on wooden racks or fermented to last through the winter. In Greenland, seal hunting and occasional whaling provided enormous amounts of meat and fat essential for communities living at the edge of habitability. Inland, deer, elk, and smaller game supplemented the diet, along with wild berries, nuts, and herbs gathered in summer. Preservation was a key to survival. Without refrigeration, Vikings turned to ingenious methods to extend the life of their food. Fish dried into stockfish could last months or even years. Meat smoked over low fires was resistant to decay. Salted pork, mutton, and beef were stored in barrels or pits. Hard cheeses, made in summer, endured through the darkest months. These techniques were born of necessity but carried a sophistication that allowed Viking societies to endure long beyond what their harsh environment might suggest. Feasting, often remembered for its political or social symbolism, was also a survival strategy. Archaeological discoveries of mass animal butchery, communal cooking pits, and large numbers of discarded bones show that feasts redistributed perishable food before it spoiled. Such events reinforce alliances but also ensure that communities collectively endured. Sharing resources reduced the risk of famine for individuals and reaffirmed the social bonds that kept communities strong during winter isolation. Clothing, fire, and food were deeply interconnected. Warm garments conserved body heat. Fire warmed both bodies and interiors, and food provided the energy needed to withstand months of cold and darkness. None of these elements alone could guarantee survival. Together, they created a system of resilience. Archaeological remains, sagas, and reconstructions all confirm the importance of this triad. Storage pits filled with grain, piles of dried fish bones, preserved wool garments, and thick layers of peat speak of families that prepared tirelessly, knowing that one mistake could mean catastrophe. In the sagas, descriptions of harsh winters emphasize the shortage of food, the desperate need for fuel, and the careful preparation of clothing. When abundance is described, it is celebrated not as luxury but as security. Survival itself was victory. The Vikings are remembered for their daring voyages, their raids, and their sagas, but their endurance in the far north was no less extraordinary. It was not ships or swords that carried them through the endless nights, but wool spun on looms, fires fed with peat, and fish dried on racks. The quiet persistence of clothing, fire, and food was a true foundation of Viking resilience. It was here, in the daily work of women weaving textiles, men cutting peat from bogs, and families preserving meat for winter, that Norse culture proved its strength. Without this triad of survival, no longship would have ever left port, and no saga would have been told by firelight. The Viking world is often remembered for its outward expansion, ships cutting across the North Sea, raiders striking monasteries, and warriors carving their names into European history. But behind the legends of conquest was another reality, the home front. For families who lived in the frozen north, defense did not rely only on swords or shields. It began with the houses themselves. The turf home, built from earth and grass, served not only as a shelter from the cold, but also as a fortress in times of conflict. In an age when raids, feuds, and territorial struggles were constant, these low, earthen structures provided hidden strength, blending the needs of domestic life with the demands of survival in war. The first layer of defense came from the landscape itself. Scandinavian settlements were often isolated, surrounded by fjords, mountains, and forests. In Iceland and Greenland, the isolation was even greater, with farms scattered across vast distances. These natural barriers made sudden attacks difficult, and when combined with the camouflage of turf houses, families gained a measure of protection. From a distance, a turf home was nearly invisible. Its grass-covered roof and low, earthen walls merged with the hillside, creating a dwelling that was as much part of the landscape as it was a structure. Raiders seeking targets along coastlines or in open valleys could easily pass by without noticing homes concealed by snow or grass. When violence did come, the very construction of turf houses gave them resilience. Walls a meter thick, packed with sodden earth, could absorb blows that would splinter wood. Arrows and spears, deadly on open battlefields, often lost their force when striking turf. Stone foundations added further stability, and the heavy roofs resisted fire better than wooden thatch. Turf was damp and dense. Sparks from flaming arrows often smoldered rather than ignite. Archaeological evidence of burned Viking halls shows that timber structures were vulnerable to fire, but turf houses frequently endured, their earth walls blackened but not destroyed. In this way, the home itself became a passive defense system, a structure that could withstand both climate and conflict. The interior of turf houses also lent itself to defense. Entrances were narrow, often designed as low, tunnel-like passages that forced attackers to crouch as they entered. This architectural feature, practical for reducing drafts and conserving heat, also worked as a choke point in times of danger. A single defender with a spear or axe could block such an entrance, holding off multiple opponents. The dim interiors gave advantage to those who knew their way around, while outsiders stumbled in the smoke-filled darkness. Families often kept weapons close at hand, spears, axes, and seekses, not just for hunting or farming, but for defense within their own homes. Feuds and local conflict were common in Viking society, and sagas are filled with tales of vengeance, raids, and house burnings. The Njal saga, one of Iceland's most famous medieval narratives, recounts a burning of Njal Gerson and his family inside their home during a feud around the year 1011. Such episodes highlight both the vulnerability and resilience of Viking houses. Turf walls resisted flames better than timber, but if attackers managed to pile wood or brush against entrances, even turf houses could be overwhelmed. The saga's account reflects the grim reality that, while homes were strongholds, they were not invincible. Defense depended as much on community ties and alliances as on architecture. The communal nature of turf farms also contributed to defense. Many settlements were organized as clusters of interconnected buildings, homes, barns, and storage rooms linked by covered passages. In times of attack, these complexes acted as fortified compounds. Families could retreat deeper into the network of turf rooms, protecting livestock and supplies along with themselves. The close proximity of neighbors, bound together by ties of kinship or alliance, meant that defense was often collective. When one farm was threatened, others nearby were drawn into the struggle, turning private disputes into community feuds that shaped Icelandic and Greenlandic history. The relationship between war and architecture was not limited to defense. Turf houses also functioned as centers of strategy and leadership. Chieftains' halls, larger and more elaborate than ordinary dwellings, served as command posts where warriors gathered, planned raids, and pledged loyalty. Archaeological discoveries at Borg in Lofoten, Norway, reveal a longhouse over 80 meters long, a structure that combined domestic functions with political and military authority. The The hearth in such halls was as much a site of planning for conflict as it was for feasting. In this sense, the turf longhouse was both home and headquarters, reflecting the dual realities of Viking life. In Greenland and Iceland, where Norse settlements existed on the edge of survival, the defensive qualities of turf houses were even more critical. The scarcity of resources made raiding a constant threat, and the isolation of farms meant that families often relied entirely on their homes for protection. Excavations at Bratteli, Eric the Red's estate in Greenland, reveal fortified turf walls and large halls that would have served both as family dwellings and as defensive strongholds against rival settlers or hostile groups. Here, architecture was inseparable from security, with every wall serving as both insulation against frost and barrier against attack. The symbolic role of turf houses in war was just as significant as their practical one. In Norse culture, the home was tied to honor. To defend one's house was to defend one's family, lineage, and identity. Sagas often describe attacks on homes not only as violence, but profound violations of social order. Burning a man in his house was considered one of the most dishonorable acts, a crime that demanded vengeance. These narratives reveal how deeply the idea of the house as fortress was embedded in the Norse mind. The home was more than a shelter. It was a symbol of the family's standing, a place worth dying to protect. Even after the Viking Age, the defensive qualities of turf houses continued to be valued. In Iceland, where turf homes were still built well into the 19th century, their ability to withstand storms, fire, and conflict ensured their survival as a tradition. They represented continuity not only with the land, but with a cultural memory of endurance in times of danger. The combination of camouflage, thick walls, narrow entrances, and community-centered layouts gave them a military utility that complemented their domestic functions. Seen in this light, turf houses can be understood as part of the Viking toolkit of survival and expansion. Ships carried warriors abroad, but houses anchored families at home, providing security when men returned from raids or when enemies struck back. Without these homes, resilient in both climate and conflict, no society might have fractured under the pressures of feud, famine, and invasion. Instead, they endured, not in stone castles or walled cities, but in low, earthen houses that stood as fortresses of nature itself. The story of turf houses in war reminds us that Viking resilience was not only about aggression abroad, but about endurance at home. Their battles were not just fought on foreign shores, but in the frozen valleys and smoky halls of their own homeland. Here, in the grassy mounds of turf, families built not only shelters but strongholds, places where survival was defended day by day against both nature and man. Life inside Viking turf houses was not only about warriors, feasts, and survival strategies. At its core, it was about families, and within those families, the daily lives of women, children, and elders shaped the rhythm of existence. These groups rarely appear in the great sagas as heroes of raids or rulers of kingdoms, yet their presence was the foundation of Norse society. Without the labor of women, the vitality of children, and the wisdom of elders, no family could have endured the endless winters or sustained the culture that defined the Viking Age. The turf house, smoky and dim, was a world, a place where the invisible work of survival unfolded day after day. Women were central to the functioning of the Norse household. Archaeological evidence and historical sources alike emphasize their role as managers of the home and farm. Within the turf house, women directed the production of food, textiles, and daily necessities. Looms stood against the walls, and the rhythmic sound of weaving was a constant part of life. Wool from sheep was spun into thread, dyed with natural colors, and woven into cloth for clothing, sails, and trade. The importance of textile work cannot be overstated. Cloth was not only a necessity for survival in the cold, but also a form of wealth, used in trade and as tribute. In many households, women controlled these resources, giving them significant economic influence. Women also oversaw food preparation and preservation. Inside the turf house, meals were cooked over the central hearth, and the responsibility for ensuring that food supplies lasted through winter often fell to the female head of the household. Butter, cheese, dried fish, and smoked meats had to be rationed carefully. Skyr, the fermented dairy product still common in Iceland, was often produced and stored under the supervision of women. Archaeological finds of cooking tools, storage pits, and residue on pottery confirmed the range of food processing tasks that defined women's work. This role carried immense responsibility. A miscalculation in rations could mean hunger or even famine for the entire family. Beyond economic labor, women played a critical cultural role. The sagas describe women as preservers of tradition, often reminding men of their duties, lineage, or honor. They were storytellers, teachers of children, and keepers of family memory. Some women, especially those of higher status, also held ritual authority. The practice of seer, a form of Norse magic associated with prophecy and ritual, was often performed by women known as vola. Turf houses, as domestic and sacred spaces, were sometimes settings for these rituals, linking women's domestic authority with spiritual influence. Children grew up in this environment of work, learning, and survival. Their lives were inseparable from the turf house, where they played, worked, and learned from their elders. Archaeological evidence of toys carved from wood and bone, small animals, ships, and game pieces reveals that play was part of childhood, but it also served as preparation for adult roles. Boys learned to carve, hunt, and eventually fight, while girls were taught weaving, food preparation, and household management. Both boys and girls contributed to chores from an early age, tending animals, gathering fuel, or helping with textile production. The sagas often mention children in passing, not as main characters but as heirs, burdens, or symbols of lineage. Their survival was paramount, for in a world of high infant mortality, each child represented the future of the family and the continuation of its name. The harsh climate and limited resources meant that childhood was often short. By adolescence, boys were expected to take part in farming, fishing, or even raiding, while girls were often married young, joining or establishing households of their own. Yet the turf house remained the crucible of their upbringing. It was here that values of endurance, honor, and cooperation were instilled. Around the hearth, they heard the sagas that preserved memory and identity. In the dim light of oil lamps, they watched their parents at work and absorbed the skills that would sustain them in adulthood. Elders, too, had a profound role within the turf house community. In a society without written records for much of its history, oral knowledge was the lifeblood of cultural continuity, and elders were its keepers. They preserved genealogies, recited sagas, and transmitted practical knowledge about farming, weather, and survival strategies. The long winters amplified their importance, as the months of darkness provided time for teaching and storytelling. Archaeological evidence of burials with staffs, amulets, and tools suggests that elders were respected not only for their wisdom but also for their connection to the spiritual world. The sagas frequently portray elders as advisors or counselors, their words shaping decisions in assemblies or family disputes. Their authority was not based on physical strength but on memory and experience. In the turf house, their presence was a reminder of continuity across generations. They were living links to the past, ensuring that knowledge was not lost in a society where every lesson carried the weight of survival. At the same time, old age in the Viking world was not without hardship. In a society with limited resources, the frail and sick could be vulnerable. Yet the sagas also contain examples of devotion to family elders, reflecting a recognition that their wisdom outweighed their physical limitations. Together, women, children, and elders formed the hidden foundation of Viking life. While warriors gained fame in raids and traders brought wealth from abroad, the work of these groups ensured that communities could endure from season to season. Their labor was often invisible in historical accounts, but archaeology and careful reading of the sagas reveal their indispensability. Inside the turf house, they spun wool into garments that kept bodies alive, tended fires that warded off frost, and taught traditions that gave meaning to existence. Without them, the Norse world could not have endured. The architecture of the turf house reflected their presence. The wide communal spaces gave women room for weaving and cooking. The narrow sleeping platforms lined with furs held children close to the warmth of the hearth. The dim corners where elders sat offered a space for memory and teaching. Every layer of turf, every beam of wood, enclosed not only bodies but relationships, the unseen web of cooperation that bound generations together. The turf house was not only a structure of survival but a cradle of family, where the young grew into adults, the strong relied on the wisdom of the old, and women guided the rhythms of life. In the broader history of the Vikings, women, children, and elders rarely appear as central figures, yet their contributions define the society as much as any raid or voyage. They embodied endurance not through conquest but through care, labor, and continuity. The sagas, the farms, and even the distant voyages across the Atlantic all rested on their shoulders. The smoky interior of the turf house, filled with the quiet work of daily survival, was their domain, and it was here that Norse culture truly lived. The turf house was more than a shelter from the cold and darkness. It was a stage where daily life and spirituality intertwined. For the Vikings, the hearth was not simply a place to cook food or warm frozen hands. It was a sacred space, the point where the domestic world and the divine world overlapped. Rituals carried out in it gave meaning to survival, connected families to gods and ancestors, and bound communities together through shared belief. While temples, outdoor groves, and sacred sites were important in Norse religion, much of the spiritual life of the Vikings unfolded inside their homes, in the smoky atmosphere of the longhouse, where firelight illuminated ceremonies both simple and profound. The hearth's central role in ritual can be traced to Norse cosmology itself. In the mythology preserved in later sources such as the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, fire and ice were the primal elements from which the world was formed. From the clash of heat and frost emerged the first beings, and from them creation unfolded. Fire was therefore more than a tool. It was a sacred force that carried echoes of the world's beginning. Every Viking hearth symbolically echoed this cosmic fire. The act of keeping the flame alive through the long night was more than practical necessity. It was a spiritual act of maintaining order against chaos, warmth against the encroaching cold of death and nothingness. Daily rituals reflected this worldview. Families often made small offerings into the hearth, casting bits of food or drink to honor the gods and spirits. Archaeological evidence of burned animal bones in domestic contexts suggests that such offerings were common. A fragment of meat, a splash of ale, or a piece of bread placed in the fire was not waste but devotion, an acknowledgement that survival depended on forces larger than human effort. In some households, these offerings were directed not only to major gods like Thor or Freya, but also to local spirits of the land, house, and ancestors believed to dwell invisibly within the family's world. Seasonal rituals amplified this connection. The festival of Jol, later absorbed into Christmas traditions, was originally a midwinter celebration rooted in the struggle against darkness. Held during the longest nights of the year, it was a time of feasting, sacrifice, and remembrance. Within turf houses, Jol was marked by special meals, the drinking of ale, and the burning of large logs in the hearth, symbolic acts of sustaining light until the sun's return. The sagas mention Jol feasts at chieftains' halls, but even the humblest turf homes likely observed the season with rituals of their own, gathering families in firelit rooms to reaffirm hope and continuity. Rituals also accompanied milestones of life. Births, marriages, and deaths were often marked in the home, with the hearth as witness. Newborns were sometimes presented at the hearth, their lives symbolically introduced to the family fire. Marriages were celebrated with feasting and oaths sworn near the flame, linking the union to both divine and ancestral approval. Death, too, was marked by rituals within the home. While burials and cremations were carried out outside, mourning and remembrance began in the turf house, where stories were told, offerings made, and the memory of the deceased bound into the living community. Archaeological finds of amulets, charms, and carved symbols in domestic settings suggest that such practices were integrated into daily life rather than confined to special temples. Women played a particularly important role in household rituals. As keepers of the home and the hearth, they were often responsible for offerings, prayers, and small ceremonies that connected the family to spiritual forces. The practice of seer, associated with prophecy and magic, was primarily performed by women known as vola. While large-scale rituals of seer were often conducted in outdoor settings, domestic adaptations likely took place within turf houses, especially in the long winter months when mobility was limited. The sagas describe vola traveling between households, performing rituals that included chanting, the use of staffs, and communication with spirits. These ceremonies often took place around the hearth, the symbolic center of power within the home. The hearth was also the site of storytelling, which carried ritual weight of its own. The sagas, myths, and genealogies recited in firelight were not merely entertainment but acts of cultural preservation. By repeating stories of gods, heroes, and ancestors, families participated in rituals of memory, ensuring that identity endured across generations. The very act of telling a saga by the hearth was a ceremony of continuity, binding listeners to the collective past. Archaeologists and literary scholars alike note how oral traditions flourished in winter, their preservation dependent on the communal spaces of turf houses. Rituals tied to agriculture and the cycle of seasons also reached into the home. Before planting in the brief northern summers, families might offer sacrifices of food or drink at the hearth, appealing for good harvests. At harvest, the first grains or loaves could be shared with fire, symbolizing gratitude. These rituals reinforce the idea that the hearth was a mediator between human labor and divine favor. The gods of fertility and weather, especially Freya, were invoked not only in open-air ceremonies but also within the domestic space where survival was directly at stake. Warfare and feuds brought their own rituals into the home. Warriors preparing for raids sometimes swore oaths around the fire, invoking divine witness to their promises of loyalty or vengeance. The sagas frequently mention such oaths, taken with weapons in hand and firelight as witness. Returning from expeditions, warriors were celebrated in the home with rituals of feasting, drinking, and storytelling, reaffirming bonds of brotherhood and family. The fire was a silent witness to these ceremonies of loyalty and honor. Archaeological traces help confirm these practices. Charred remains of offerings, amulets buried in hearths, and deposits of animal bones inside domestic sites suggest that turf houses were not spiritually neutral spaces. Instead, they functioned as small sanctuaries where everyday life was infused with devotion. Scholars of Old Norse religion increasingly emphasized the domestic dimension of worship, recognizing that the turf house was as central to spirituality as any outdoor grove or temple. The endurance of these rituals had cultural consequences far beyond the turf house. They reinforced resilience in times of hardship, provided psychological relief during months of darkness, and sustained community identity across generations. The blending of domestic and sacred also reflected a worldview where the divine was never far away, where gods and ancestors inhabited the same spaces as families, sharing the warmth of the hearth. The rituals and the glow of the hearth remind us that Viking survival was not purely physical. It was also spiritual and cultural. Families did not simply endure the winters by eating stored food and wearing woolen cloaks. They endured by giving meaning to hardship, by framing their daily struggles within a cosmic narrative of fire, gods, and ancestors. In the dim, smoky halls of turf houses, every spark carried echoes of creation, every offering reinforced bonds of the unseen, and every story preserved a legacy. Without these rituals, survival would have been bare existence. With them, it became endurance with meaning, a continuity of life that bound together past, present, and future. In the long, dark winters of the Viking world, when snow buried the land and wind howled across fjords, daily life inside the turf house was reduced to survival. Yet amid the silence of isolation and the dim flicker of firelight, another form of life thrived. Storytelling. Tales told in shadows became the cultural heartbeat of Norse society, weaving together memory, myth, and identity. These stories were not idle entertainment. They were the repositories of history, morality, and worldview. The sagas that would later be written in medieval Iceland were born in these moments, passed down by word of mouth as families huddled together in smoke-filled halls. To understand Viking culture, one must understand the power of stories told by firelight. Oral tradition was a foundation of Norse memory. In a society without widespread writing during the Viking Age, words were the primary medium of continuity. Elders, poets, and skilled storytellers carried in their minds the sagas of heroes, the myths of gods, and the genealogies of families. The performance of these tales was both art and duty. Around the hearth, in the dim light of burning peat or wood, the storyteller's voice rose above the crackle of flames, transforming shadow and silence into vivid worlds of gods, monsters, and legendary ancestors. Archaeological evidence of musical instruments such as lyres and flutes, combined with saga descriptions of skalds, poets who composed and recited verse, suggests that storytelling was often accompanied by rhythm and song, deepening its emotional impact. The content of these stories range from the mythic to the historical. Myths explain the cosmos, with tales of Odin, Thor, and Loki shaping how people understood fate, morality, and divine will. The great battles of Ragnarok, the trickery of Loki, and the might of Thor were not distant fictions, but living frameworks through which families interpreted their own struggles against nature and fate. Alongside myths stood heroic sagas, recounting the deeds of legendary warriors and explorers. These tales, often rooted in real events but expanded through generations, celebrated courage, loyalty, and endurance. Genealogies anchored families to their past, reciting the names of ancestors who linked the living to the dead. In a culture where honor and lineage defined status, knowing one's ancestry was as important as knowing how to farm or fight. The act of storytelling itself carried ritual weight. Stories were not merely spoken, they were performed. Skalds trained in complex meters and kennings, poetic phrases that replaced simple word with layered imagery, elevated storytelling into an art form. A sword might be described as a wound ice, or the sea as a railroad, turning language into a tapestry of metaphor. These linguistic techniques, preserved in Old Norse poetry, reveal the sophistication of oral tradition. In the shadows of turf houses, such poetry resonated not only as entertainment, but as cultural memory encoded in rhythm and verse. Children grew up immersed in this world of stories. For them, tales were both instruction and inheritance. By hearing sagas, they learned the values of their society: bravery, loyalty, hospitality, and the pursuit of honor. They also absorbed practical knowledge, as many tales embedded lessons about farming, seafaring, or the consequences of betrayal. Elders, in turn, used stories to preserve continuity. Each retelling reinforced a bond between generations, ensuring that the wisdom of the past was not lost in the dark isolation of winter. The sagas written down in the 13th and 14th centuries in Iceland, works like the Saga of the Volsungs, the Njál Saga, and the Egil Saga, bear the clear imprint of this oral tradition. Scholars widely agree that these texts were the product of centuries of oral refinement. Their episodic structures, formulaic expressions, and use of repetition all point to origins in spoken performance. The written sagas we know today are therefore fossilized echoes of countless evenings in turf houses, where families listened as a history and mythology unfolded in the voice of a storyteller. Storytelling also served political and social purposes. Chieftains and leaders hosted feasts where skalds performed in exchange for patronage. A well-told saga or poem could enhance a leader's prestige, immortalize victories, or shame rivals. Skaldic poetry, in particular, was tightly bound to power, used to praise kings or chieftains and secure their legacy. Archaeological finds of high-status drinking vessels and imported luxury goods at feasting sites suggest that storytelling was as much a tool of politics as it was a form of entertainment. In these settings, Tales were not only cultural treasures but instruments of influence. Even in ordinary turf houses, however, storytelling carried immense social weight. The act of gathering around the hearth created unity in a world where isolation could easily breed despair. In the darkness, listening together reinforced bonds of trust and identity. Stories transformed confinement into community, giving meaning to nights that might otherwise have been unbearable. Modern anthropologists studying oral cultures describe this effect as social glue, and in the Viking Age, it was no different. Storytelling held families together as much as fire and food. Archaeological evidence helps us imagine these moments. Excavations of turf houses reveal benches lined with furs along the walls, perfect for gathering listeners. The central hearth provided light that cast flickering shadows, while small lamps added dim illumination. Smoke hung in the air, creating an atmosphere both oppressive and intimate. Within this space, a voice could transport listeners beyond the walls of their home to distant battlefields, mythical realms, or ancestral farms. The physical constraints of the turf house amplified the power of words, turning spoken tales into immersive experiences. The endurance of these stories across centuries testifies to their importance. Despite the hardships of famine, disease, and conflict, the Norse preserved their oral heritage with extraordinary fidelity. When Icelandic scribes finally committed the sagas to parchment, they did not invent them but recorded what had already lived for generations in fire-lit halls. This preservation allowed Norse culture to outlast the Viking Age itself, carrying forward its values and worldview into the modern era. Without the tales told in shadows, the Viking world would be far poorer, its memory fragmented and forgotten. The significance of storytelling in Viking turf houses lies not only in the content of the tales, but in their role as survival mechanisms. They provided hope in the darkest season, reinforced cultural identity in isolated communities, and ensured that values were transmitted across generations. Stories gave meaning to suffering and placed human struggles within the grand narrative of gods and fate. They were a reminder that hardship was not senseless but part of a larger story, one that linked the smallest turf house to the vast cosmos. In the end, the image of tales told in shadows captures the essence of Viking endurance. Around the fire, in homes half buried in earth, families listened to voices that connected them to ancestors and gods. In those moments, the darkness outside mattered less, for within the smoky hall burned the light of memory, imagination, and meaning. The sagas that survive today are not relics of parchment, but echoes of countless voices in countless nights, when stories carried the Norse people through winters that seemed endless. The turf house was more than a clever response to cold. It became a defining element of Norse identity. What began as a regional adaptation in Scandinavia and Iceland expanded across the North Atlantic, following the Vikings as they pushed into new frontiers. Wherever the Norse settled, they carried with them the knowledge of cutting sod, stacking blocks of earth, and shaping the land into shelter. The spread of turf architecture tells a larger story of migration, adaptation, and cultural persistence in landscapes that tested the limits of human survival. The roots of turf building lay deep in Scandinavia, where early Iron Age longhouses already incorporated sod and earth in their walls. Archaeological evidence from Jutland in Denmark and sites in Norway shows that turf linings were used to reinforce wooden structures long before the Viking Age. These were not yet the fully developed turf houses of Iceland or Greenland, but they revealed a growing awareness of Earth's insulating power. By the 8th and 9th centuries, as the Viking Age began, Norse builders had refined these techniques into more sophisticated forms, combining stone foundations, wooden frameworks, and thick turf walls. The great leap forward came with the colonization of Iceland in the late 9th century, when Norse settlers, led by figures such as Ingolf Arnason, established themselves on the island around 874 CE. They faced a land with limited forests but abundant grasslands. Timber, so crucial in Scandinavia, was quickly depleted. Within a generation, turf houses became the dominant form of architecture. Excavations at Reykjavik, the site of Ingolf's original farm, reveal the remains of early turf buildings with stone bases and interlocked sod walls. These structures were larger and more durable than earlier timber houses, reflecting both necessity and innovation. Iceland's environment demanded turf, and the settlers responded by perfecting it. From Iceland, turf architecture spread further west of Greenland. Around 985 CE, Eric the Red led settlers to the island's fjords, establishing farms in areas such as Brattahlid in the eastern settlement. Greenland's climate was harsher than Iceland's, with longer winters and shorter summers. Here, turf construction reached even greater thickness and complexity. Archaeological remains at Brattahlid and other sites show walls over 1.5 meters thick, combining turf, stone, and sometimes whalebone to withstand Arctic conditions. The Norse adapted their homes to a land where survival margins were razor-thin, and turf houses became indispensable strongholds of warmth and endurance. The Faroe Islands also witnessed the expansion of turf culture. Settled by Norse communities in the 9th century, the Faroes lacked large forests but offered grass-covered hillsides ideal for turf cutting. Traditional Faroese turf houses, many still standing in modern times, reflect direct continuity with Viking-era building techniques. The characteristic green roofs and sod walls blend seamlessly with the landscape, echoing the same principles of insulation and camouflage that guided Norse settlers more than 1,000 years ago. Beyond the Faroes and Greenland, the Norse carried turf building knowledge to even more distant frontiers. Archaeological evidence from Earthen's auxiliary meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, the only confirmed Norse site in North America, reveals turf construction alongside timber and stone. The remains of sod-walled structures, discovered in the 1960s, show how the Norse used familiar methods to adapt to a new world across the Atlantic. Though the settlement was short-lived, it demonstrates how central turf building was the Norse identity. Wherever they went, they sought to recreate the earth-built homes that had sustained them in the north. The spread of turf culture was not only geographical but also social. As Norse communities expanded, turf houses became markers of settlement and permanence. Building in turf required investment of time and labor, signaling an intention to stay. In Iceland and Greenland, farms with extensive turf complexes, such as those at Glombe and Kelda, symbolized wealth and authority. Chieftains displayed their power not only through ships and feasts, but also through the scale and sophistication of their homes. The architecture itself communicated stability and control in a world often marked by uncertainty. Turf building also spread through cultural memory, embedded in sagas and traditions. Medieval Icelandic texts often describe houses with sod walls and grass roofs, confirming their ubiquity. The sagas portrayed turf homes as settings for both daily life and dramatic events, feasts, disputes, rituals, and even violence. By recording these stories, Icelandic scribes ensured that turf architecture became part of the enduring image of Norse society. The expansion of turf culture also reveals how the Norse balanced continuity with adaptation. In each new land, they adjusted their building methods to local conditions. In Iceland, turf replaced scarce timber. In Greenland, thicker walls and stone reinforcements met the demand of extreme cold. In the Faroes, sod houses were shaped by steep hillsides and strong winds. At Earthen's auxiliary meadows, timber from nearby forests was combined with turf to build hybrid structures. This adaptability ensured that turf culture could travel across oceans without losing its essence. The persistence of turf houses long after the Viking Age ended testifies to their success. In Iceland, turf homes continued to be built into the 19th century, evolving in form but retaining the same principles. Their survival across centuries shows that turf was not a primitive or temporary solution, but a sustainable, practical technology that endured alongside more modern forms of architecture. Even as stone and timber houses became symbols of wealth in Europe, the Norse and their descendants clung to turf as the most effective response to their environment. The expansion of turf culture also carried symbolic weight. Turf houses represented a philosophy of living with the land rather than against it. By merging homes into hillsides, The Norse created dwellings that were almost invisible in the landscape, demonstrating a humility and pragmatism often overlooked in portrayals of Vikings as conquerors. Turf houses embodied a form of ecological adaptation that modern observers recognize as sustainable and harmonious with nature. In the end, the spread of turf architecture across the North Atlantic illustrates the resilience and resourcefulness of the Norse. From the fjords of Norway to the coast of Newfoundland, these homes followed the Vikings wherever they settled. They were more than buildings. They were cultural anchors, carrying the memory of home across oceans and into new worlds. The turf house was both a product of necessity and a symbol of identity, a reminder that Norse expansion was not only about raiding and trade, but also about building communities capable of enduring in the harshest environments on Earth. For all their resilience, the Vikings lived in a fragile balance with the land that sustained them. The turf houses they built were remarkable symbols of adaptation, but they also revealed a precarious relationship between human survival and natural resources in the North Atlantic world. Every block of sod cut from the ground, every sheep grazed on a hillside, and every tree fell for timber left a mark on an environment that could easily be pushed to its limits. In a region where the growing season was short and resources scarce, missteps in managing the land could lead to disaster. The story of turf houses, therefore, is not only one of ingenuity but also of environmental tension, a constant negotiation between use and preservation, survival and exhaustion. The Norse settlers who first arrived in Iceland around 874 CE were greeted by a landscape that seemed rich with opportunity. Vast grasslands covered volcanic soil, rivers teemed with fish, and herds of wild animals roamed freely. Forests of birch and willow dotted the lowlands, providing timber for building. Yet within a few generations, much of this apparent abundance was depleted. Archaeological and environmental studies confirmed that deforestation began almost immediately after settlement. Timber was cut for houses, ships, and fuel, while grazing animals, especially sheep, prevented regrowth. By the 11th century, large portions of Iceland were stripped of woodland, leaving settlers increasingly dependent on turf and stone for building material. The turf house itself was a response to this environmental shift. With forests gone, settlers turned to the earth as their primary construction resource. Cutting sod for houses was sustainable in small amounts, but as farms expanded, the demand for turf increased. Large complexes like Glombe or Kelder required enormous quantities of sod harvested from surrounding pastures. This put pressure on grasslands already needed for grazing livestock. Overgrazing, combined with turf cutting, contributed to soil erosion. Modern soil studies in Iceland show layers of erosion dating back to the Viking Age, when fragile topsoil was stripped away by wind once vegetation was removed. In this way, turf houses symbolize both adaptation and strain. They allowed survival but also accelerated ecological fragility. Greenland presented an even starker example of this fragile balance. When Eric the Red led settlers there around 985 CE, the fjords of the eastern and western settlements offered fertile land for grazing and farming. Turf houses with thick sod walls rose along the fjords, but the environment was unforgiving. Harsh winters, shorter growing seasons, and limited forests meant that settlers relied heavily on livestock. Sheep, goats, and cattle grazed on delicate Arctic pastures, which recovered slowly, if at all, from overuse. Archaeological evidence shows that erosion in Greenland began to increase within a century of settlement. Combined with climatic changes, the onset of the so-called Little Ice Age in the 13th century, the Norse colonies faced dwindling resources. By the 15th century, the Greenland settlements had collapsed, their turf houses abandoned as wind and frost reclaimed the land. The fragile balance with nature was also evident in how Norse communities managed fuel. Fire was essential for survival, but wood was scarce in Iceland and Greenland. Families cut peat from bogs and dried it for fuel, but overharvesting could damage wetlands. Whale oil, seal blubber, and animal fat supplemented fires, but these too required constant hunting. Archaeological layers filled with bones of seals, walruses, and fish reveal the intensity of Norse reliance on wild resources. Each hunt risked depleting populations, though the abundance of the North Atlantic often concealed the danger until it was too late. Agriculture faced similar pressures. Barley and rye could be grown in Iceland during favorable years, but yields were limited. Poor harvests, combined with soil erosion, forced greater dependence on livestock. Yet the very animals that provided wool, milk, and meat also worsened the erosion problem. Sheep in particular were destructive grazers, stripping vegetation close to the ground and preventing regrowth. By the later Middle Ages, parts of Iceland had been transformed into barren landscapes, their topsoil blown away by winds. The saga literature often mentions famine and hardship, reminders of the balance between farming, grazing, and resource use was constantly at risk. The sagas themselves reflect an awareness of this tension. In stories such as Egil Saga or Njal Saga, disputes over land and grazing rights often spark feuds. Control of pastures, access to water, and the management of livestock was central to survival, and conflicts over these resources could escalate into violence. The sagas also describe famines that struck when harvest failed or livestock perished in harsh winters, highlighting the fragility of life on the margins of the Arctic. These narratives, though often focused on personal drama, reveal the constant pressure of environmental limits. Even in mainland Scandinavia, where resources were more abundant than in Iceland or Greenland, the balance remained delicate. Timber was available in Norway and Sweden, but farming was confined to narrow strips of arable land along fjords and valleys. Harsh winters limited crop yields, and over-reliance on livestock could strain available pasture. Communities learned to manage resources carefully, but the cycle of scarcity was always close at hand. Archaeological evidence of storage pits filled with grain and meat reflects the constant need to plan ahead, while mass grave from famine periods remind us of the cost of imbalance. Modern scientific studies shed further light on this fragile relationship. Soil cores from Iceland reveal a dramatic increase in erosion after settlement, coinciding with the introduction of livestock and turf cutting. Pollen analysis shows a sharp decline in forest cover, replaced by grass and heathland. In Greenland, isotopic analysis of bones from Norse graves indicates dietary shifts over time, with settlers relying increasingly on marine resources as agriculture became less sustainable. These findings confirm that the Norse were constantly adjusting their strategies in response to environmental decline. Yet it would be a mistake to view the Vikings as reckless exploiters of the land. They developed strategies to mitigate damage, such as rotating pastures, cutting turf from specific areas, and diversifying food sources. The endurance of Icelandic society, despite centuries of erosion and deforestation, demonstrates a remarkable capacity for adaptation. Turf houses themselves, though contributing to ecological strain, also represented a sustainable technology by minimizing reliance on scarce timber. What emerges from the archaeological and historical record is not a story of simple collapse, but a community's walking a fine line between sustainability and survival. The fragile balance with nature also shaped Norse philosophy. Myths and rituals emphasize respect for natural forces, from the sea gods who governed fishing to the fertility gods who oversaw harvests. The constant threat of famine, storm, or disease reinforced a worldview where humans were not masters of nature but participants in its cycles. Turf houses, blending into the earth, reflected this ethos of coexistence, even as they embodied the paradox of exploiting the very land they sought to live with. Ultimately, the story of Viking turf houses is inseparable from the story of environmental tension. These homes were ingenious responses to scarcity, but they also drew heavily on fragile resources. Their survival depended on delicate ecosystems that could be destabilized by overuse, climate change, or simple miscalculation. The collapse of the Greenland settlement stands as a stark reminder of what happened when balance tipped too far, while the endurance of Iceland shows the possibilities of adaptation and resilience. In both cases, the turf house was a stage on which humanity and nature struggle for equilibrium. The Vikings remind us that survival is never only about innovation, it is about managing the limits of the natural world. The fragile balance with nature that defined their existence remains a lesson for our own time. Just as they cut sod and graze sheep with caution and risk, so too do modern societies confront the delicate relationship between human ambition and environmental capacity. The earthen walls of Viking turf houses whisper not only of endurance but also a warning that every shelter, every farm, and every community rests on the balance that can be broken. For centuries, turf houses were the backbone of Norse life in the North Atlantic. They represented ingenuity, adaptation, and resilience. Built from the very earth they stood upon, they had sheltered countless generations, endured storms, and provided warmth against some of the harshest winters in the world. Yet even the most enduring traditions eventually yield to change. The decline of turf houses was not sudden, but gradual, shaped by shifting economies, evolving technologies, cultural transformations, and new materials that redefine what it meant to build a home. Their story is one of long endurance, but also of slow disappearance, as societies left behind their earth-built walls in favor of timber, stone, and later, modern construction. The first seeds of decline were sown in the Middle Ages, when trade and wealth expanded across Scandinavia. As societies grew richer through commerce, raiding, and political consolidation, elites began to distinguish themselves with new architectural choices. Chieftains and kings increasingly built larger timber halls and, later, stone churches and fortresses. These structures were not only durable but also visible markers of power and prestige. While turf houses blended into the land, timber halls and stone buildings announced authority across valleys and fjords. Archaeological sites in Norway, such as Borg and Lofoten, show how monumental longhouses combine turf elements with heavy timber, reflecting a transition from earth to wood as a primary expression of status. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the Christianization of Scandinavia also transformed architecture. Stone churches began to dominate town centers, and the cultural prestige of stone spread into secular life. In Iceland, where turf houses remained common, bishops and wealthy farmers still lived in sod-built dwellings, but the influence of Europe was unmistakable. As contact with continental styles increased, the humble turf house began to seem provincial, associated with poverty rather than innovation. Practical challenges also contributed to decline. Turf houses, for all their effectiveness, required constant maintenance. Roofs had to be reseeded, walls patched, and drainage ditches dug year after year. A neglected turf house could collapse within a generation. As labor demands shifted with growing populations and new farming practices, some families found it easier to invest in more permanent timber or stone structures. In regions where forests were still abundant, timber provided flexibility, while in areas rich in stone, masonry promised durability with less upkeep. Archaeological remains show that by the late medieval period, turf houses often stood alongside timber barns or stone outbuildings, a sign of gradual replacement. Climate also played a role. The onset of the Little Ice Age in the 14th century brought harsher winters and shorter growing seasons, especially in Greenland and Iceland. While turf houses provided insulation, the strain on pastures and resources intensified. In Greenland, the Norse settlements collapsed entirely by the 15th century, leaving behind abandoned turf homes reclaimed by frost and time. In Iceland, turf houses endured longer, but the harsher climate made maintenance even more demanding. As European ships brought new materials, such as sawn timber, nails, and eventually industrial goods, turf construction increasingly seemed outdated. The rise of towns and urban life further accelerated the decline. Turf houses were best suited for rural farmsteads, where space and sod were plentiful. But in growing towns like Reykjavik or Trondheim, turf was impractical. Stone, brick, and timber buildings allowed for denser construction, multi-story architecture, and fire resistance in crowded conditions. By the 17th and 18th centuries, urban centers across Scandinavia had largely abandoned turf in favor of modern styles, leaving sod-built homes as rural relics. By the 19th century, turf houses had become associated with poverty in Iceland and other remote regions. Travelers from Europe often described them with disdain, remarking on their dark interiors, smoky air, and damp walls. Illustrations and travelogues from the period depict turf houses as backward compared to the stone and timber dwellings of continental Europe. Yet for many Icelanders, they remained the only viable option until industrial materials became affordable. Entire communities still lived in turf homes well into the 1800s, their endurance a testament to necessity rather than choice. Reformers in the 19th and early 20th centuries actively campaigned to replace turf houses with modern housing. As Iceland moved toward independence and modernization, turf homes were increasingly viewed as symbols of hardship rather than heritage. Government programs encouraged the building of timber-framed or concrete houses, and turf construction rapidly declined. By the mid-20th century, turf houses had all but disappeared from daily life, replaced by modern structures that reflected global architectural trends. Yet decline was not absolute erasure. Some turf houses were preserved as cultural artifacts, recognized for their historical significance. Sites such as Kelda and Lofurs in Iceland became museums, offering glimpses into the past. Scholars and archaeologists documented their construction techniques, while artists and writers celebrated their role in shaping Icelandic identity. In recent decades, a revival of interest in sustainable architecture has also sparked renewed appreciation for turf houses, highlighting their ecological design and low environmental impact. What once was seen as primitive is now recognized as innovative, offering lessons for modern builders confronting climate challenges. The decline of turf houses is thus a complex story. It was not a simple replacement of one style by another, but a gradual process shaped by wealth, religion, climate, technology, and culture. Turf houses endured for over 1,000 years because they worked. They kept people alive in some of the harshest environments on Earth. Their disappearance reflects not failure but transformation, as societies changed and sought new ways to express identity and meet practical needs. Today, the surviving turf houses stand as reminders of a world where survival depended on listening to the land, shaping it into shelter and maintaining a fragile balance with nature. The story of their decline also reminds us of the human tendency to undervalue traditions when faced with new technologies. For centuries, turf houses represented ingenuity and resilience, yet by the modern era, they were dismissed as relics of poverty. Only later, through preservation and study, did their true value become clear. Their fall from daily use was not the end of their significance, but the beginning of their place in cultural memory. In that sense, turf houses never fully disappeared. They live on as symbols of adaptation, endurance, and a deep relationship between people and the earth itself. Although turf houses ceased to be a dominant form of architecture in the 19th and 20th centuries, their echoes remain strong in the modern world. These earthen homes, once dismissed as primitive shelters of poverty, have become celebrated symbols of heritage, sustainability, and identity. From preserved farmsteads turned into museums to cutting-edge discussions of ecological building, turf houses continue to speak across centuries. They remind us of the human capacity to adapt and of the enduring dialogue between architecture and environment. Their survival into the present, even if only in memory and preservation, shows how the wisdom of the past can illuminate the challenges of today. In Iceland, turf houses are among the most visible echoes of the Viking past. Preserved sites such as Lofurs, and Kelda attract visitors from around the world. These complexes, carefully maintained and restored, offer rare glimpses into the daily life of Norse families. Walking through their dim interiors, modern visitors can experience the smoky air, narrow passageways, and grassy roofs that once defined life for centuries. Archaeologists and historians use these sites to study construction methods, lifestyle, and adaptation strategies. For Icelanders, they are more than museums. They are tangible links to ancestors who endured centuries of isolation, famine, and hardship. The survival of these structures into the modern era provides a sense of continuity, anchoring national identity in the resourcefulness of earlier generations. The echo of turf houses is also present in literature and art. Icelandic sagas, which often mention sod-built homes, remain central to national culture, and modern writers, poets, and visual artists frequently draw upon turf houses as symbols of resilience and rootedness. In paintings, photographs, and novels, they appear not simply as ruins but as metaphors for endurance against overwhelming odds. Their grassy roofs, blending into hillsides, have become iconic images of harmony between human habitation and nature. In contemporary Icelandic design and marketing, turf houses are often invoked as part of a national brand, representing both tradition and sustainability to global audiences. Beyond Iceland, echoes of turf culture persist in the Faroes, Greenland, and Norway. In the Faroes, traditional sod roof houses remain part of the modern landscape, often combined with timber and stone. These living structures demonstrate continuity with Viking-era traditions, showing that turf construction did not entirely vanish but adapted to modern needs. In Greenland, archaeological remains of Norse turf houses are studied not only as relics of past colonization, but also as lessons in environmental limits. The abandoned settlements of the Norse are poignant reminders of how fragile the balance with nature could be. In Norway, sod roofs on cabins and farm buildings still appear in rural areas, blending practical insulation with cultural memory. These modern adaptations show that the Viking legacy of building with earth continues, even if transformed. The most surprising echo of turf houses, however, is in the field of sustainable architecture. In recent decades, as societies grapple with climate change and environmental degradation, architects and designers have looked back to older building traditions for inspiration. Turf houses, with their thick insulating walls, renewable materials, and harmony with landscapes, offer striking examples of ecological design. Their ability to maintain stable indoor temperatures with minimal fuel resonates strongly with contemporary concerns about energy efficiency and sustainability. In some parts of Iceland and Scandinavia, experimental houses have revived turf roof concepts, integrating them with modern construction techniques. Green roofs, now common in eco-friendly architecture worldwide, can be traced directly to traditions of turf building. What was once necessity has become innovation again. Educational programs further carry the echoes of turf houses into the present. Schools, heritage sites, and cultural organizations in Iceland and beyond teach students and visitors about the construction and meaning of these homes. Workshops on traditional sod cutting, wall building, and roof maintenance ensure that the techniques are not forgotten. By learning how ancestors lived with the land, modern generations gain not only historical knowledge but also practical skills that may find new relevance in a changing climate. The echoes are also felt in tourism. Iceland, in particular, has embraced turf houses as cultural attractions. Visitors from around the globe are drawn to these grassy structures, fascinated by their simplicity and ingenuity. Turf houses feature prominently in documentaries, travel shows, and photography, shaping how the Viking world is imagined today. While this commodification sometimes risks reducing them to picturesque curiosities, it also ensures their preservation and integration into the modern economy. In this way, turf houses continue to contribute to survival, not against Arctic winters, but within a globalized, tourism-driven economy. The memory of turf houses also serves as a moral echo. Their story illustrates a delicate relationship between humans and nature, a theme that resonates powerfully in the modern world. The collapse of Norse Greenland, where overgrazing and climate change combine to overwhelm fragile ecosystems, is often cited in discussions of sustainability. The endurance of Iceland, where communities adapted to centuries of environmental strain, provides a contrasting lesson of resilience. In both cases, Turf houses were central, shelters that embodied the possibilities and limits of human adaptation. For modern societies facing ecological crises, these echoes offer sobering warnings and inspiring examples. The transformation of turf houses from symbols of poverty to symbols of heritage reveals much about changing values. In the 19th century, they were derided as backward, reminders of isolation and hardship. In the 21st century, they are celebrated as ecological marvels, embodiments of national identity, and icons of sustainable living. This reversal underscores how architecture is never only about materials but also about meaning. Turf houses endure not because they are still lived in, but because they continue to speak about survival, identity, and the wisdom of working with the land rather than against it. Today, the echoes of turf houses can be seen in every sod-roof cabin, every green roof in an urban cityscape, and every museum farmstead where visitors step into the smoky dimness of past. They remind us that survival is not only about innovation, but also about humility, learning from the earth rather than imposing upon it. In this sense, turf houses are not relics of a vanished world, but participants in ongoing conversations about how humans build, live, and endure. Their grassy walls may no longer house families through long winters, but their memory shelters ideas that remain as vital as ever. For the Vikings, shelter was not only a matter of architecture, it was a reflection of worldview. The turf house, with its thick earthen walls and grass-covered roof, represented a philosophy of life as much as a solution to cold. To build one's home out of the land itself was to accept a truth central to Norse existence, that survival depended on harmony with the environment, resilience in the face of hardship, and respect for forces beyond human control. Turf houses were not monuments of dominance like castles or cathedrals. They were expressions of humility, ingenuity, and a deep-rooted philosophy of shelter that still resonates today. The physical design of turf houses reveals this philosophy in practice. Unlike stone castles, which towered above the landscape, turf homes blended into it. From a distance, they were almost invisible, their grassy roofs merging with the hillsides. This invisibility was not weakness but wisdom. It reflected an understanding that humans were not separate from the natural world but part of it. The Norse did not impose their will upon the land with monumental structures. They shaped the land into homes that acknowledged its power. Shelter was not conquest but coexistence, a principle visible in every sod wall and grassy roof. The philosophy of shelter was also practical. In the unforgiving climates of Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands, survival required adaptation, not defiance. The turf house embodied this mindset. Its thick walls captured the earth's insulating properties. Its living roof recycled itself with every season, and its materials were renewable and local. There was no need for vast imports of stone or lumber. The land itself provided what was needed. To build in turf was to embrace efficiency rather than excess, an architectural humility born of necessity but carrying profound meaning. Norse mythology and cosmology also reinforce this philosophy. The myths preserved in the Poetic Edda and Prose Edda describe a universe shaped by the balance of elemental forces, fire and ice, gods and giants, life and death. Humanity's place in this cosmos was fragile, never absolute. Turf houses, blending human life with earth, reflected this cosmological balance. The hearth at the center of the home echoed the cosmic fire that gave birth to the world, while the sod walls recalled the primal earth from which life emerged. To live in a turf house was to dwell within a microcosm of the universe, a space where myth and survival overlapped. The communal nature of turf houses further expressed the Norse philosophy of shelter. Extended families lived together in shared halls, their lives intertwined in interdependence. Shelter was never an individual achievement, but a collective one. Building a turf house required neighbors to cut sod, haul stones, and raise timber beams. Maintaining it required ongoing cooperation. The home itself became a physical embodiment of fellowship, an architecture community that reflected social values. To the Norse, survival was not solitary but collective, and the turf house was its architectural manifesto. The philosophy extended into ideas of wealth and status. In Europe, castles and manors symbolized the power of lords and kings, but in Iceland and Greenland, chieftains lived in turf complexes much like their neighbors. The difference was in scale, not style. Even the wealthy accepted the same principle of earth-built shelter, demonstrating that in these harsh lands, nature's demands leveled distinctions. Status was displayed not by defying the landscape with grandeur, but by building larger within the same humble tradition. The philosophy of shelter was egalitarian at its core, rooted in shared vulnerability to climate and environment. The fragility of turf houses also reinforced humility. Unlike stone fortresses that could stand for centuries without care, turf homes demanded constant maintenance. Roofs had to be reseeded, walls patched, and drainage ditches cleared. Neglect led quickly to collapse. This reality instilled a philosophy of stewardship. To inhabit a turf house was to accept responsibility for continual care, a reminder that survival was an ongoing process rather than a permanent guarantee. Shelter was not static but dynamic, requiring vigilance and labor. In this way, turf houses embodied a cyclical view of life. They rose from the earth, sheltered families for generations, and eventually returned to the soil. When abandoned, turf houses decomposed naturally, leaving little trace beyond faint mounds in the landscape. Unlike stone ruins that stand as monuments of permanence, turf homes embodied impermanence. They reminded their inhabitants that human life, like architecture, was transient, dependent on nature, vulnerable to time, but capable of renewal. This philosophy of impermanence aligned with Norse beliefs about fate and the inevitability of decline. To live in a turf house was to accept mortality while affirming resilience. Modern observers often interpret this philosophy as ecological wisdom. In an age of climate change and environmental crisis, turf houses are admired for their sustainability. Their use of local materials, energy efficiency, and harmony with landscapes embody principles now embraced by green architecture. Yet for the Norse, these qualities were not ideology but necessity. The philosophy of shelter arose not from choice but from survival. The echoes of this necessity, however, continue to inspire. By showing that effective shelter can be achieved without excess or domination, turf houses offer enduring lessons to societies seeking balance with the earth. The sagas themselves capture glimpses of this philosophy. Though focused on feuds, voyages, and heroes, they describe homes as places of gathering, ritual, and endurance. Turf houses appear as settings for life's dramas. Their smoky halls a backdrop for both tragedy and triumph. In these stories, the home is not incidental but central, the axis of survival and meaning. The philosophy of shelter was woven into narrative as much as into architecture, reminding listeners that endurance began at home, within walls of sodden firelight. In the end, the turf house was more than a building. It was an idea that shelter could be drawn from the earth itself, that humans could survive not by overpowering nature but by adapting to it. This philosophy defined Norse life in the north, sustained communities through centuries of hardship, and left echoes that continue to resonate in modern thought. The walls of turf houses may have crumbled back into the soil, but their meaning endures, a philosophy of shelter that sees survival not as conquest but as coexistence, not as permanence but as resilience. The story of Viking turf houses is not only a chapter of the past, but also a mirror for the present. These earthen dwellings, shaped by necessity in a world of limited resources, continue to speak across time. Their lessons echo into an era where humanity faces its own trials with climate, sustainability, and the search for balance with nature. To look back at the turf house is to see more than a relic of survival. It is to glimpse a philosophy of resilience that carries urgent meaning for our own uncertain future. The first lesson is the value of adaptation. The Norse settlers who built turf houses did not arrive in Iceland, Greenland, or the Faroe Islands with ready-made solutions. They encountered unfamiliar landscapes, stripped of abundant timber and subject to brutal winters. Their success lay in their ability to adapt, to replace wood with earth, to see soil not as ground beneath their feet, but as a resource for walls and roofs. This capacity to adapt quickly and pragmatically ensured their survival. In today's world of shifting climates and rising populations, adaptation remains essential. The Vikings remind us that survival belongs not to those who resist change, but to those who embrace it, reshaping practices to meet the demands of environment. The second lesson is humility before nature. Turf houses embodied an acknowledgement that human beings were not masters of their surroundings, but partners with them. Their builders did not attempt to dominate the land with monumental stone or grand palaces. Instead, they shaped homes that merged into hillsides, that breathed with soil and grew with grass. In an age when modern societies struggle with the consequences of exploiting natural resources, deforestation, pollution, and climate instability, the turf house offers a vision of coexistence. Its walls remind us that true shelter does not separate humanity from nature, but connects us more deeply to it. Another lesson lies in sustainability. Turf houses were built from local, renewable materials. Sod was cut from nearby fields, stones gathered from ground, timber used sparingly where it could be spared. Their design minimized waste and maximized energy efficiency. Thick turf walls provided insulation that required no external fuel, while roofs renewed themselves each season as grass continued to grow. In an age where construction contributes heavily to carbon emissions, the turf house demonstrates that architecture can be both practical and sustainable. Modern green roof movements, eco-homes, and sustainable design practices echo principles that the Vikings employed over 1,000 years ago. The fourth lesson is resilience through community. Turf houses were rarely built or maintained by individuals alone. Their construction required collective labor, neighbors cutting sod, raising timbers, and repairing roofs together. Daily life inside them demanded cooperation, with families sharing warmth, food, and stories. This communal resilience sustained Norse society through famine, storm, and isolation. For the modern world, where individualism often overshadows collective responsibility, the turf house offers a reminder: survival is not solitary. In facing global challenges such as climate change, pandemics, and resource scarcity, solutions will be found not in isolation but in cooperation. The failures of the turf house also carry lessons. In Greenland, Norse settlers struggled to maintain balance with fragile ecosystems. Overgrazing, soil erosion, and reliance on livestock in an unforgiving climate contributed to the collapse of their settlements. Archaeological evidence shows that as conditions worsened, the Greenland Norse became increasingly dependent on marine resources, but adaptation came too late. Their story warns us of the dangers of ignoring environmental limits, of clinging to traditions when flexibility is required. The contrast between the collapse of Greenland and the endurance of Iceland underscores the importance of proactive adaptation, a lesson as relevant to modern societies facing climate change as it was to Norse farmers in the Arctic. Another enduring lesson is the importance of memory. The sagas, born in the smoky halls of turf houses, preserved not only stories of gods and heroes, but also lessons about survival, honor, and community. These narratives carried cultural wisdom across generations, teaching resilience in the face of hardship. In our own time, where technological change threatens to sever connections with tradition, the Norse remind us of the importance of storytelling, memory, and cultural continuity. The survival of knowledge can be as vital as the survival of bodies, for it shapes how communities respond to crisis. Modern architecture has already begun to rediscover what the Vikings knew. Green roofs are now found in cities from Reykjavik to New York, offering insulation, biodiversity, and beauty. Sustainable design principles emphasize local materials, energy efficiency, and harmony with landscape, all echoes of turf house philosophy. Yet there remains much to learn. The Vikings did not view these principles as luxuries but as necessities. Their lives depended on them, and their houses embodied them. By studying turf houses not only as historical artifacts but as models, Modern builders can rediscover ancient wisdom suited for future challenges. The lesson of impermanence also emerges from turf houses. Built from living earth, they rose, endured, and eventually returned to soil. Unlike stone castles that sought permanence, turf homes embrace transience. This acceptance of impermanence carries its own wisdom. In a modern world obsessed with growth and permanence, turf houses remind us that not all structures must last forever. Sometimes the most sustainable path lies in building lightly, leaving fewer scars on the earth, allowing renewal and change. Finally, turf houses teach us that survival is about meaning as much as material. Families did not endure winters only because of food and fire. They endured because of rituals, stories, and faith. Around the hearth, they gave purpose to struggle, weaving hardship into a narrative of gods and ancestors. In times of global uncertainty, this lesson resonates. Survival requires more than technology and resources. It requires shared meaning, cultural resilience, and the ability to frame struggle within a larger story. In the end, the lessons of turf houses are not nostalgic curiosities but urgent teachings. They remind us that human life is fragile, bound to the earth and dependent on its limits. They remind us that survival requires adaptation, humility, sustainability, and community. They remind us that memory and meaning are as vital as walls and roofs. In their earthen mounds, overgrown with grass yet still standing in Iceland and the Faroes, turf houses whisper across time. Build wisely, live humbly, and endure together. The story of Viking turf houses is, at its heart, the story of endurance. For more than 1,000 years, families carved their lives into the earth, shaping blocks of sod into walls, laying timbers across stone foundations, and planting roofs that grew as the seasons turned. These houses were never grand monuments meant to awe the eye. They were humble, practical, and deeply tied to the land. Yet in their simplicity, they carried a power that outlasted kings, battles, and even entire colonies. Beneath the grass, they held the essence of survival. Turf houses represented a dialogue between human need and natural limits. In the unforgiving climates of Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroes, they provided warmth when forests had vanished, stability when storms raged, and shelter when winter stretched for months without end. They were solutions born of necessity, but they also revealed a worldview, that survival meant working with the land rather than against it. Their walls of sod and earth did not defy nature, they embodied it. To live in a turf house was to accept that humanity was part of the landscape, bound by its cycles, dependent on its gifts, and vulnerable to its harshness. Inside their smoky interiors, entire societies were sustained. Women spun wool, wove cloth, and managed the supplies that kept families alive. Children played with carved wooden toys while learning the skills of farming, fishing, and crafting. Elders preserved memory, reciting genealogies, myths, and sagas that tied generations together. Around the hearth, rituals honored gods and ancestors. Stories were performed, and feasts bound communities into fellowship. In these dim holes, culture was not only preserved but created. Without turf houses, there would be no sagas, no continuity of memory, and perhaps no survival of Norse identity itself. The endurance of turf houses also lay in their adaptability. They shifted shape and form as the Norse spread across the North Atlantic. In Iceland, they grew larger and more complex, with interlinked rooms and passageways. In Greenland, they thickened their walls to withstand harsher cold. In the Faroes, they clung to steep hillsides, and at Eland's auxiliary meadows in Newfoundland, they adapted to a new continent. Everywhere the Norse went, they carried this architectural knowledge, proving that turf houses were not relics of one land but a mobile tradition, flexible enough to endure across oceans. Yet endurance was always fragile. The collapse of Norse Greenland shows what happened when the balance tipped, when overgrazing, soil erosion, and climate change combined to overwhelm fragile ecosystems. The turf houses that still stand in ruins, silent witnesses to both resilience and failure. In Iceland, where adaptation continued, turf houses lasted into the 19th and even 20th centuries, reminders of a people who survived in one of the most marginal environments on Earth. Their endurance was not guaranteed. It was earned, season by season, through labor, vigilance, and cooperation. As time passed, turf houses were abandoned, replaced by timber, stone, and later concrete. In the eyes of many, they became symbols of poverty, reminders of hardship and backwardness. Yet even as they declined, they carried within them lessons that modern societies are only beginning to rediscover. Their ecological design, energy efficiency, and reliance on local materials resonate powerfully in an age of climate crisis. Their communal construction and maintenance reflect values of cooperation that remain essential today. Their impermanence, their rise and fall back into the soil, remind us that no structure is eternal, and that perhaps true sustainability lies not in permanence but in renewal. The endurance beneath the grass is not only architectural but cultural. Turf houses preserve communities through centuries of famine, disease, and isolation. They nurtured oral traditions that became sagas, some of the greatest literary treasures of the medieval world. They offered not only survival but meaning, turning hardship into narrative, existence into identity. In their walls, people endured not just physically but spiritually, finding purpose in rituals, stories, and the shared labor of survival. Today, their echoes remain visible in museums, heritage sites, and even modern eco-architecture. Tourists walk through preserved turf houses in Iceland, marveling at their simplicity and ingenuity. Architects study their principles for inspiration in sustainable design. Locals regard them with a mix of pride and reverence, seeing in them not only relics of the past but foundations of national identity. Their endurance beneath the grass has become endurance in memory, a cultural legacy as important as the buildings themselves. The conclusion of the turf house story is not simply its disappearance, but its transformation. From necessity to heritage, from poverty to pride, from obscurity to inspiration, turf houses have shifted meaning over time. They no longer house families through endless winters, but they continue to shelter ideas that matter for the future. They remind us that survival is possible in the harshest conditions, that sustainability is not a modern invention but an ancient practice, and that the relationship between humanity and nature is both fragile and profound. In the end, the endurance of turf houses lies not in their physical walls but in the lessons they leave behind. They whisper across centuries that survival requires humility, adaptation, cooperation, and meaning. They show that architecture can be more than shelter, it can be philosophy, and they remind us that even the humblest of homes, built from nothing more than sod, stone, and timber, can carry within them the strength to endure ages of hardship. Beneath the grass, the Vikings found not only warmth but continuity, and in their legacy, so can we,